My name is Mona El-Kafif. I'm an associate professor here at UVA and want to welcome everyone to our symposium on housing, the subtitle Affordable Housing in the 21st Century City. I want to quickly hand over before we have an introduction to the studio brief and also our guest today to Felipe Correa, who is the chair in the architecture department at UVA.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Mona, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words here today. First, and above all, a huge thank you to all the faculty and the students of the third semester architecture core, 7010 studio, for co-convening this event. And of course, also a huge thank you to all of our speakers that are sort of putting time into this afternoon and sharing a lot of their work with us. In an ideal and sort of conventional world, we would have been on campus at UVA, and we would have had a great sort of a round of drinks and dinner after today's event. So Manuel, Mark, Robert, and Moses, we owe you a dinner at some point. First, I would like to say that for me, it is extremely important, not only that we're having this symposium, but that the 7010 studio is tackling housing as its main course of study, primarily in a studio that looks at housing as a way in to begin to examine larger issues about urbanism and the urban. As we see sort of the importance of housing and how we actually, as designers, sort of participate in the larger argument of constructing affordability in housing in cities, we've also seen, I think, through many architecture schools, the disappearance of housing in the design curriculum. And I think, I know for me, I know for sort of all of the faculty members that teach in 7010, housing is an integral part of an architectural education. And not only a way for us to begin to look at how we actually design units, design the space of housing, but also the role that architecture plays in a larger construct of domesticity and urban life. And I think that this is actually quite fantastic about this studio. Additionally, I think this symposium is very timely and of course very relevant to a lot of the discussions that are happening around housing in New York City today. And perhaps one of the most interesting parts about the symposium is that it's not a school-wide event, but it's an initiative that emerges from the studio itself. And therefore, the topics that are being discussed are directly sort of woven with the larger discussions and arguments put forward by the studio. Finally, the last thing that I'll say is that I think the selection of speakers is quite powerful in many ways, but there's one that really sort of caught my attention, which is that today's conversation will actually sit at the confluence of design and larger sort of planning and urban policies. And I think that this is a dialogue that architects, planners, and sort of the larger constituencies that make up the design of the built environment need to continue to have in order to find new paths towards the implementation of sort of more of new and more experimental projects. And I'm really looking forward not only to the individual presentations, but to the dialogue that is going to emerge from sort of both the perspective of practices that are quite phenomenal and accomplished in the way that they sort of produce ideas of domesticity through design and larger ideas of how we envision housing and domesticity in the urban realm and in New York specifically. So thank you for organizing this. Very happy to be here and looking forward to learning a lot this afternoon. Mona, back to you.
Thank you, Felipe. This was a wonderful way of framing the symposium. Maybe for everyone once more, Moses Gates and Robert Lane are visiting us today from the Regional Plan Association. Mark McCrate is an associate principal at David Adjaye Associates. And we also have Manuel Bailo, who is principal at Bailo Rural Ed Plus from Barcelona, and also a colleague, a very dear colleague from us at UVA. I want to also thank you, Matthew and Katie, for helping with the preparation. And at the end of the panel discussion, at the panel presentations today, we will have students and student moderators who are going to take on to ask our guests questions that are critical in general in relationship to housing, but also in relationship to the work that they have done so far. I want to quickly give everyone a very brief overview what the Studio 7010 includes usually. It's a big housing studio where we test the capacity of architecture and its typology to not only act as an object, but as an agent within its urban environment. It is taught by myself, Matthew, Joel, Esther Lawrence, and Ali Fard, and we also have Katie Casabales and Ian Klein as roving faculty. An exciting excursion that we are taking on this semester. The studio is usually, or in the last years, was located in New York, as New York is a place where UVA has a huge alumni network. I'm assuming that a lot of you are joining us today. Thank you for taking your time. And we usually bring students to the site, have site visits, office visits. This year we have a more virtual and remote version of it. But New York is basically for our MArch students an urban laboratory where we investigate a lot of questions that are related to urban design, landscape architecture, and architecture. As Felipe mentioned, and which is obviously also clear in the title of the symposium, we are taking on housing, but specifically the need for public housing, also really articulated in the Housing New York 2.2 plan that was released a couple of years ago, where Mayor de Blasio announced that until 2026, 300,000 new housing units have to be built in New York. And this is done through a lot of different ways. And it's also covering not only public housing or affordable housing, but housing through all income ranges as well as in all neighborhoods. We were specifically interested to look at city-owned land, because city or publicly owned land, as here the city has a huge capacity to generate new modes and new models for housing. And you will see in the choice of sites that we looked at and selected. This year we are working in Manhattanville that has a huge impact at the moment through the campus extension of Columbia, but it's also between Harlem West and Columbia. It is a place that has its own identity and its own history. So we had fantastic lectures already that had been dedicated to the history and the identity of Manhattanville. And here we chose 3 sites. 2 of them are already city-owned or publicly owned, and one of the sites is site number 2 in our fictional public-private partnership. We are collaborating here with Columbia University. These areas are under development. There are a lot of new mixed-use district improvement plans set in place, specifically in relationship to the extension or the conversion of 125, the historic corridor, into a cultural destination and cultural corridor that connects to the waterfront. And there's obviously also the plan set in place for the Columbia extension. There are interesting public-private partnerships set in place, which is also a way for New York specifically to allow developers to have an increased FAR, but to get something back for the city or for the parcel that is developed. And one of these, our sites, is very close to the manufacturing district, where where there's currently a project in process. So we are, and that's the reason why I'm showing this, asking our students to work within a fictional public-private partnership that invests less into parcel-specific incentives, but incentives that are spread across the neighborhood. And we are really looking forward. We will start this process now in the next assignment. We had fantastic guests, and I just want to thank Garnett Padogan once more, our Porter Chair this year, who gave a fantastic lecture on the identity and the questions of Manhattanville, where he interviewed local activists, stakeholders, and researchers who worked in Manhattan. Well, and this was really a fantastic input. So I think Garnett is here in the audience. Once more, thank you very much for your support.
Thanks. Well, first of all, really a huge welcome to our guests today. We had an incredible roster of speakers. Let me just quickly do an introduction. First of all, we have Moses Gates. He's the Regional Planning Association Vice President for Housing and Neighborhood Association's Vice President for Housing and Neighborhood Planning. And the Regional Planning Association is a nonprofit based in New York City. Moses leads the organization's planning, research, and advocacy efforts in affordable housing, economic development, and urban design. He joined RPA in 2016 and has led their RPA's recommendations on affordability, economic development, in livable neighborhoods for the 4th Regional Plan, and has authored many kind of reports on housing policy and neighborhood planning. He's also worked at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, which is a nonprofit affordable housing developer, and is a licensed New York City tour guide, which is interesting. He's currently a visiting assistant professor at the Pratt Institute and serves on the board of directors for Neighborhood Housing Services of New York City. And he studied at Hunter College, University of Wisconsin, and is author of the memoir Hidden Cities, which was published in 2013. Robert Lane. Rob is a founder and principal of Plan and Process LLP. It's an urban design and architecture practice devoted to building local capacity through community-based planning and design, research and education. He is a senior fellow for the community design and development at RPA, which is devoted to combating sprawl and making more beautiful and complete communities. He is also responsible for the design content of RPA's just released 4th Regional Plan, which I mentioned, Moses, including the 4 Corridors Initiative. And he also co-managed RPA's participation in the Rebuild by Design Hurricane Sandy initiative. He's the author of numerous adoptive vision plans, zoning ordinances, and design guidelines. And his research projects have been funded by the National Endowment for the Arts and the New York State Council to focus on industrial district urban design and development, and co-authored a book on the subject, The Design of Urban Manufacturing, released by Routledge just this spring, past spring. He's also was an associate previously at Cohen Peterson Fox and James Stewart Polshek partners, and received his bachelor's at Cornell and studied also at Columbia, where he did his master's. He was a Loeb Fellow, actually, GST from in 2008. Mark McQuaid, he's an associate principal at Agia Associates and co-heads the New York studio overseeing projects in North and South America and the Caribbean. He joined the firm in 2010 and played a key role in the growth of the U.S. office, having led numerous cultural, civic, and commercial projects. He was responsible for the Sugar Hill mixed-use development in Harlem, which is a LEED silver low-income housing project, challenges traditional housing typology, which one of our students, who we've been studying in the studio, in the 7010 studio. He also led the design of the interior spaces of the Smithsonian National Museum for African American History and Culture, which is a LEED Gold building, which if any of you have not seen that, you must make a visit to the project. He's currently working on several projects, one in New York City Tower and also Princeton University Art Museum and Cultural Facility, and also Riverfront Park in downtown Detroit public space. He's, along with practicing architecture, Mark has also taught with David Adjaye at studios at Princeton, and also was editor-in-chief for David Adjaye's Replacing Art and Architecture, and was also co-edited the book Landform Building, Architecture's New Terrain with Stan Allen, which I'm sure many of you also have copies of. He studied previously at UC Berkeley and also and got his master's at Princeton. Lastly, Manuel, as Mona mentioned, Manuel is an associate professor at UVA and is also founder and principal at Vila Rural Architects, which he formed in 1995 with Rosa Rural in Barcelona. The work of the practice, as described, we understand architecture as a constellation system which is shaped by the distinct relationships between chunks of information. Every piece of data establishes its own intensity and brightness within each project, creating a particular and unique constellation. Social, historical, environmental, and health issues are all organized across the human scale, movement, texture, and body, defining each specific project. I had to include that that text because I love that text. So it's great to have Manuel joining. He's done incredible array of projects working from the urban to the interior scales, and his work has been exhibited at MoMA, New York, and has won awards across Europe and also in Asia. He did his PhD actually in urban space and public space, which was a really fascinating PhD. And as I mentioned earlier, he's associate professor at UVA, but also leads the Barcelona program. So welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to stop my screen share now, and maybe Robert, you can go ahead and start with your presentation.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to thank Matthew and Mona and the other faculty for having us, and to Felipe especially. I suspect he is the real culprit for why I'm here. And I want to just second Felipe's comment about the importance of the housing as a studio program. This presentation is going to be a little bit schizophrenic, or maybe in the spirit of what Felipe was saying in terms of an intersection, because I'm at heart a formalist, so talk as much about housing as I could. In the end, my presentation is kind of more about design and physical planning. But then my partner in this presentation, Moses, his presentation is much more around financing and planning issues. And also in keeping with my role of regional planning, my presentation starts at like 30,000 feet. So maybe it's appropriate for us to have started off this way. So the few slides I'm going to show are organized around these three framing concepts: the relationship of the housing program to the region, the relationship of the housing program to potential alternative programs, and the relationship of the housing program to the ground. As has been mentioned, RPA just released our fourth regional plan. And one of RPA's responsibilities is to suggest a preferred growth pattern for the region, which we did through a series of scenarios. And what our studies revealed, and I would argue that this has gotten added impetus from the COVID crisis, is that now in the 21st century, we are a polycentric and beyond polycentric region, with large numbers of people reverse commuting out from the city to employment centers like White Plains and Stamford, Connecticut, and other people making all kinds of asymmetrical journeys to dispersed locations at every time of the day. I would say actually that beyond polycentric, we are now a hybrid region. I Googled hybrid and I found this image from a biology textbook on hybrid speciation. And truthfully, I'm not a biologist, so I have no idea what that means. But I think it is a perfect analog for the way our region has matured, with the tidy concepts about urban, suburban, and rural that informed the previous radio regional plans, superseded by a much more nuanced formulation and sort of hybrid conditions and situations where there are centers that seem to have different spheres of influence, a lot of kind of scattered in between stuff that is kind of unaccounted for in our conventional work. And then of course the hybrid condition is a cultural phenomenon as well, with mixed populations bringing expectations of place and ownership of place in the broadest sense of the word that are very different. To serve this pattern, we anticipate a revolution in mobility on two fronts. First, the need to combine all of the separate regional transit entities, which don't talk to each other at the moment, into one regional express system, similar to the model that already exists in many European metropolitan regions. In a truly regional system, there would still be a lot of commuting into the region's core, but it would be also possible to take one or 1+ or 1+2 seat rides seamless between regional centers, say from Stamford, Connecticut to New Brunswick, New Jersey, with the train behaving more like a subway as it passes through the core. The second is knowing that even the most robust regional system will have trouble serving the dispersed locations of the hybrid region. We imagine irrigating the fixed guideway system into the larger landscape to what is called combined mobility, enabling the seamless connections and fare payments between all modes, including smaller vehicles. So what are the implications of this for the site? First of all, it may be to understand that this place might become a reserve of affordable housing for regional destinations, that there are potential new connections to an integrated regional rail network. You have the Hudson Line immediately adjacent to the corridor. And that there's a relationship between transportation costs and affordability, and that you should therefore plan for and make space for mobility in all of its forms. The second framing idea is the relationship to alternative programs. And I know this is something that Felipe likes to explore in his studio. We have to acknowledge, first of all, that there are constantly changing and fluid conceptions of family. This doesn't only mean family units that are intergenerational or families with two mothers or two fathers. It also has to do with live-work conditions, anticipating, for example, the future of working from home. Flexibility is essential. In the early part of my career as an architect, I did a lot of housing, including this building in Battery Park City for what was then Polshek and Partners, now ENIAD. These buildings, as successful and as urbanistically responsive as they are in some ways, are absolutely intractable. That is, the locations of utility chases and columns make adaptation of these units almost impossible. This makes intergenerational and programmatic succession very difficult. And to that point, and this is no surprise to those of you like Felipe who know my work all too well, another alternative program to consider with housing is urban production writ large, really expanding the way we think of mixed use and of live work, including production plus housing, vertically stacked, such as this building in Vancouver. And also the relationship to Columbia University may be important here. The role of these buildings as an anchor institution for an innovation district. This is something that our colleague from Barcelona will know all too well. This is a kind of term of art, but for the purposes of this brief presentation, basically an innovation district means a place where intellectual capital is monetized by prototyping new product development. Relevant precedent shown here is Portland State University's new Innovation District Master Plan. The industrial legacy of this location is interesting in this regard, and some of the features of that legacy may still be worth exploiting, such as the adaptive reuse of the remaining industrial buildings and access to rail and water for goods movement. We've seen during the COVID crisis, the revolution in goods distribution. This relates to the point about combined mobility I made earlier. How is this place supplied and how can it supply other places, and what role do new modes of goods movement play in that? So again, what are the implications for this site? First of all, the need to design flexible prototypes that can accommodate different family and program configurations over time, including some that we cannot anticipate. To consider the role of live work, including new forms of urban production and distribution and the reuse of some of the industrial buildings. And to think about the relationship to the new Columbia University buildings. Is this all part of a program for a new innovation district? The third and last framing idea is the relationship to the ground plane. Perhaps more than any other program, housing and verticality are linked through a long, complex, and ambiguous history. We all have associations with the various benchmark moments in this history, the bel étage of the boulevards in Paris or the Piano Nobile in Italy, both calibrating elevation above the street to social status. The tower in the park also has become this kind of shorthand for failed social engineering, even though there are many examples of successful tower in the park housing, and not just for social housing in Europe, but for developments in North America. In fact, the formal relationship between vertical elevation and socioeconomic stratification is extremely ambiguous. Conventional real estate puts a premium on height. The higher you go, the more expensive the apartment. Super tall is the most extreme manifestation of this, but it's true for less extreme models as well. Meanwhile, affordable housing puts a premium on a close relationship with the ground plane. This was at the core of the defensible space arguments made in the 60s and 70s by Oscar Newman. This has spawned a wealth of retrofit strategies for tower in the park housing estates, in which low-rise infill is used to reestablish this relationship to the ground for reasons of placemaking, passive security, et cetera. and for passive ownership, broadly conceived. Ownership, quote unquote, of the ground is becoming more complex as we become a more cultural, diverse community, as suggested at the top of this presentation. What is so interesting about this site is that there are multiple real and implied grades. And this is in part a kind of a consequence of the dramatic natural topography here, but it is also the product of the artificial grades implied by the different elevations of various infrastructures, such as the elevated Henry Hudson Parkway, the elevated Amtrak rail line, the elevated Riverside Drive viaduct, as well as levels created by buildings, such as the courtyard spaces captured in between high-rise buildings. And I would say the High Line in this sense is kind of as successful as it has been as a kind of urban intervention project, is a failure by this criteria because the relationship between the new artificial grade and the abutting buildings is completely sterile. So I think there is a very exciting opportunity here to exploit access to those different elevations and create new relationships beyond the housing and the different grade planes, to go far beyond the simplistic formulas that are associated with both the tower and the park and its antithesis of defensible space surrounded by low-rise buildings, as well as enabling in section new forms of mixed use that we speculated about earlier. So again, what are the implications for this site? I think it is to exploit the multiple real and implied grades to explore the complexity of the relationship between affordable housing and elevation. Is there high-rise, such a thing as high-rise affordable housing? To exploit the multiple real and implied grades to consider in section the ways that different programs intersect, and to explore new ways to represent these relationships in section. And so with that, we're gonna sort of change gears pretty dramatically. Moses.
All right, thanks, Rob. My slides are not nearly as fancy, nor am I an architect. I'm only a humble urban planner. But I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of some of the challenges in terms of the New York City Housing Authority and public housing when it comes to repair, redevelopment, and reimagination of the campuses. If you have not been following in New York City, there's been a lot of discussion about the physical deterioration of NYCHA, of public housing. Our public housing was physically in very good shape for a very long time. As late as 2008, the Housing and Vacancy Survey, which we do here every 3 years in New York, described public housing as being in excellent condition. But eventually disinvestment catches up with any physical structure, deferred maintenance starts to spiral, buildings start to crumble, and you get in a situation like we have today where you have tens of billions of dollars needed for repair. And there's been a lot of discussions on how to raise money for repair for NYCHA, and I wanted to go over one of our kind of things that we had looked at, which is expanding transferable development right sales. Right now, transferable development rights allow you to kind of sell off unused floor area ratio on the same tax block, with a couple of exceptions for things like landmarks and a few special districts. Right now, if you look at that, the slide that was up for a minute, the bar chart slide.
I'll go to it.
NYCHA has a very large problem, and the problem is that because of the super block developments, generally speaking, the housing authority site will take up an entire block, which leads nowhere to be able to transfer development rights. This is not 100% the case. Every once in a while, you'll find a private site on a corner, which is, something that's happened in one development, the Ingersoll houses in Fort Greene, for instance. But for the most part, you're not able to raise money through air right sales, because there's nowhere to sell the rights. This has left NYCHA kind of really reliant on the RAD program, Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, which kind of transfers management to private owners. on the infill program, which means developing market rate or mixed income houses directly on NYCHA campuses. And both of these have proved, I would say, infill more than RAD, controversial among residents, and have been tough for NYCHA to really get through. So what we had looked at is if you could expand the transferable development right areas for public housing, how much could you sell and how much money could you raise for repairs? And you can look, we did a citywide analysis across the street, which is, you know, the kind of next step and is what's done for landmarks, doesn't really raise a lot. But once you get up to a half a mile, it becomes enough that you can start to sell off the pretty much all of the development rights. And we have an example from the next slide. So here, this is the largest public housing development, not just in New York City, but in the country, which is the Queensbridge houses in Long Island City. And you have two problems. The first problem is the Queensbridge houses take up the entire tax block, which you can see there. The second problem is that if you wanted to build infill on the site, if you look closely, there's no real way you can do it. You know, even though there's technically the zoning to allow you to build more, and NYCHA can get around a lot of zoning constraints anyway, from just a simple design standpoint, you can see that the only real viable site is in the middle of those donuts. You know, you can't really do good urban design here. You can't kind of do more development with street frontage, you know, on street frontage with the kind of walkable mixed use type of neighborhood that, you know, we've all decided is a good type of neighborhood. Instead, what you would have to do is build towers in the middle of those donuts. I mean, that's physically the only place you can do that. And, you know, I think we would all agree, you know, that that's not really the best neighborhood design. And I think you would be hard pressed even to walk around New York or any other large urban city and find something like that, where you have, you know, a large tower in the middle of a, you know, lower rise developments, you know, apart from the street. So what we looked at was, if you expanded, and this is the slide on the right, if you allowed NYCHA to sell those sites and only develop them in a contextual way using New York City contextual zoning rules, what would the surrounding neighborhood potentially look like with a, you know, with a soft site and zoning analysis? And you can see it's pretty viable and leads to a pretty, you know, not a lot of out of context development, and what we would consider fits in well with the neighborhood. So this was kind of our proposal, not just for Queensbridge, but for NYCHA overall. This takes a lot to make work. The first thing it needs is a high market area. You know, construction costs in New York City are high, and there is not a lot left over for buying unused development rights in lower market areas. But this would unlock all of the development rights. Probably you would not even need a half a mile. You'd need maybe about a third of a mile or so to be able to do that. Whereas only allowing transfers across the street would still landlock quite a bit of development rights. What this does, and I think Rob might have showed a picture of this before, is this opens up the ability to actually plan for design on NYCHA campuses. Right now, NYCHA plans for money. NYCHA wants the highest value sites and the most development on those highest value sites to be able to raise the most money to fix the buildings. And it's not right up to the edge. You know, there are some mixed income proposals, you know, that maybe are a little less lucrative, but also let you take advantage of some tax breaks. And so there is a little flexibility in there, but the starting point is very much, how do we maximize development? How do we maximize revenue? If you're able to take a different starting point, if you're able to take the starting point of how do we make a more livable campus, how do we improve the lives of local residents? How do we modernize the buildings? How do we bring the buildings and the NYCHA campuses into the local community and connect them? If you can start from that, what this proposal does is it allows NYCHA to have another means to raise money. And it allows them to plan for the best campus, regardless of how much money it might raise, because they have another way to monetize those development rights. And this can work, you know, in the Morningside Heights and around the Columbia area, because it is that kind of market. It is a kind of high priced market where you would be able to sell and affect a lot of the air rights. And in fact, we looked at a development, the Frederick Douglass houses, a little further south on the Upper West Side. So I think I will leave it at that.
You want to say anything about this?
No, I think we're a little over time, so I will save this for another time. And wanted to turn it back over to the class professors.
Yeah, we might want to come back to it because it looks like it does deal with these ownership.
Yeah,
but I'll stop sharing there. And
that's great. Thank you very much. Fantastic talks and very interesting. It's a fascinating segue actually into Mark's talk on the project in Sugar Hill, because on the one hand, you know, you're identifying Moses and Robert, like the challenges that are being faced by developing and redeveloping areas in New York. But in Mark's case, I'm actually kind of very curious to understand more about how the Sugar Hill fits within that framework, and in terms of how it does or does not respond to some of the elements that Moses and Robert have talked about. But thank you very much. Mark, it's all yours.
So excited to walk you through Sugar Hill. This is a project that's really dear to my heart, and it's been really important for our office. It was important for us in the studio to have really our first, you know, significant U.S. project, significant of scale. It was very conscious and very particular that it was a project like Sugar Hill, which is an affordable housing project. So excited to kind of walk you through that. And really the context of what we're working on and working with when we did Sugar Hill was, obviously there's a good amount of history here that I'm sure everybody knows quite well, and the students have been looking at with affordable housing, which is, you know, a model that's built on a very particular kind of architecture, you know, and we were working within those constraints of HPD budgets of, you know, basically $240 a square foot of a brick facade with double hung windows. And those are really metrics that have stood for a while and are based on a kind of pancake building, similar to kind of like what you're seeing here, right? That kind of history. And we all know this very well from being in the city and going through, and I'm sure, you know, many cities have this kind of architecture. And really one of our key challenges was to see how we could break that up, how we could change that and do something different. And one of the key factors here was that it was a project that was not just housing, but combined more than housing and had multiple programs. So we'll talk through some of those things. And so this is some of the background, you know, and when we talk about affordable housing in New York, that actually is quite a big range. And, you know, what was great about working with Broadway Housing, who's the nonprofit client who developed this, was that they really are focused on the lower tier of affordable housing, because in New York, that's quite a big range. And so, you know, there's lots of stats we could look at, but this is really just a kind of crude graph to show you that the problem is not going away. And, you know, as you can see over time from 2013 to 2015, you know, that lower tier, it's really an issue and really needs to be addressed, and it's kind of only getting worse. And I think a lot of this is really credit to, you can see up on the top right, a very special person, Ellen Baxter, who was our client. She founded Broadway Housing. And this was, you know, not the first time that they had done a project, but it was the first time they had done a new building, a new construction. So you can see some of the other ones below, Dorothy Day Apartments, the Rio. They had 6 other projects beforehand where they really, you know, for the last 30 years, she's been sort of in the trenches, if you will, understanding how to make these kinds of programs work, you know, and do housing there, all renovations of existing buildings, all would kind of, you know, within the zone of that Harlem neighborhood. And so she had really done a lot of fantastic groundwork and legwork, and also knows the kinds of in and outs of new market tax credits and systems that, the logistics to make some of these things work and to fund it. And so credit to her. And it really was through that this is also the first time that they had really formalized different programs coming together other than just the housing component. So Dorothy Day Apartments before them had a very small gallery and a small school. They realized that it wasn't enough to just do housing, but that there were some key other supportive components that could be there. And they were really the seeds of what we ended up kind of developing in Sugar Hill. So here you can just see some of the other projects that they had done in Sugar Hill on the right. And then as we often begin all of our work, always, we're not just understanding the context of the program and the space, but also the context of the place, and the history here. So this is the site from way back when, where it was, not too long ago, 100 years ago, it's basically farmland. You don't have to go back very far to understand that this is a very different landscape than what we see today. And just trying to understand some of that history, which you'll see later on ties into some of the work and materiality that we did in the building. On the left here, you can kind of see the existing building that happened before we made Sugar Hill. So there's a gas station down here. This is on 155th, so not too far from the sites that you guys are looking at, but obviously a slight little walk away. And this is really the existing context here. This was an old parking garage where, in the amazing part, the histories here at Sugar Hill with the Harlem Renaissance are, every block you go, there's an unbelievable story about the different characters who were here. This is a parking garage where Duke Ellington used to park his garage. And so a lot of this was us trying to understand those narratives and mine it and bring it forward and not lose some of those histories. And then you can see some of the context here. It is a neighborhood that has a real rich architecture to it, but also a real varied architecture to it. On the right, you're seeing lots of different colorations. You're seeing bay windows in and out, different scales and heights. So really walking through the site and trying to understand that. And then, as I mentioned, things like the Harlem Renaissance, the histories here are so beautiful and rich and powerful, and really trying to make sure that this project at Sugar Hill could be a kind of beacon that represents those, that embraces those, particularly in terms of its location and where it is on the hill and some of the network that's around there in terms of this history, going all the way down to some of the areas you guys are looking at and things like the Apollo on 125th. Here it is in terms of its site context. This is 155th here, going through in St. Nicholas Avenue. To the right there on the east is the Harlem River, Yankee Stadium just across the way. And this is a really early, very early sketch. It started out as a competition that we got this project. Broadway Housing had set it up, and we were it was an invited competition, so we were competing with many others. And this is David's really original sketch very early on. So it gives you a sense of, obviously, we went through lots of different things as we developed this project, and things changed as they always do on projects. But it gives you a good sense of our process, that even early on, there's a kind of DNA in David's sketch of an idea that made its way through toward the end. So this is kind of from the competition time. And you can see some of the kind of shifting of the blocks and the massing and the band of glass that happens at the lower ground level that you'll see some of the photos later. And here's a quick section through it. You can understand that kind of shift. And as we see some of the context and site photos, that shift is really related to the datums also of the neighborhood and the context buildings around. And then as you get to the right, which is sort of the south end, there's a series of terraces, light wells that bring light down to the kind of museum down below, and a kind of drive on the right with our shared neighbor, DEP. It's a 13-story building. Here you're seeing, it's actually the second floor, but it's sort of considered the ground floor. And the plaza is on the left. And really this is where you have the entry to the building, and it has the three major entries. So we have both a preschool, we have obviously the entry to the affordable housing that then kind of takes you up, and we have an entry to the museum. On the south here, if you can kind of see my cursor, this is actually a drive. And what is maybe kind of interesting in this moment is early on, this site here where the plaza is not technically the project site. Our neighbor just to the south here is DEP, and as DEP does, they have lots of cars and trucks and things that need to park. And this plaza site is actually their property. But given the kind of steep slope of the hill, it's a perfect place on the corner to have both the entry to the building, a kind of public plaza and public gesture, but also things to just practically to make it kind of ADA accessible and handicap accessible. So currently, before we built the building, that was sort of a bricked up wall where basically they would park cars. So we effectively kind of negotiated a trade with them where we said, look, if we could take over this area, which is yours, and make this a kind of public plaza, and give you this area, which is our property, which is adjacent to their building, and be able to, they can then have doors and things out to that area. You can get your cars closer and have more efficiency there and get what you need to do and park all your cars. But we could have a public plaza that you can enjoy, that the community can enjoy, and it's right on the corner. So this is one kind of early negotiation and swap that we did that really kind of unlocked a lot of the plan diagram and section diagram to sort of make it happen. And, you know, I think as often goes with architecture projects, you know, you can see certain things through the image and stuff, but hopefully what I'll be able to reveal and unravel for you as we go through some of these are just some of the hidden stories or back negotiations or, you know, some of the untold stories or things that are sort of necessary as one does any of these kinds of projects. This is a quick plan through the lower level, which is really just showing what's actually effectively the basement, but we've turned it over into two things. On the street side, it is a rental space for a not-for-profit organization. There's a parking garage entry here. Yankee Stadium being across the way, that, you know, the site originally had parking on it, and there was a good need for that given Yankee Stadium. A lot of people would come over here, park, and go walk to Yankee Stadium just across the bridge. And Broadway Housing, I think insightfully thought, well, we need parking and we can have that be a tenant down below, and that'll be a good revenue generator. So that's that entry there. And then the bulk of this you're seeing is what is now the kind of children's museum. And it's effectively the basement. It's the leftover space, if you will, kind of 30 feet below grade, but it really has been coordinated and designed to have lots of natural light and be kind of expansive space as a museum. So I'll walk you through some of that. A kind of typical plan upstairs, you know, we have everything from studio to 1-2 bedrooms, some 3 bedrooms. And really it was also about, on that kind of tower like this, that's 13 stories, about finding some areas where there can be some outdoor space. So this happens to be kind of on the 2nd floor. There's a long terrace here that residents can use, and where the X's are is actually kind of courtyards and light wells that are about bringing light down into the preschool and provide kind of play courts for the school itself. Just to the south, there's a long 105-foot skylight, and as we'll see in some of the pictures, that brings some of the natural light down into the museum. It's very typical kind of double-loaded corridor and efficient units for this kind of thing. But as you can see, maybe in these plans, there are some minor tweaks to it. So kind of by the elevators, we have a wider depth corridor, and as you get to the ends, they get a little narrower. So just some of this kind of perspective game. It's a very simple, subtle trick, but it starts to help on these what are inevitably very long corridors to have a little perspective and have a little relief. And then here up on the top plan, this is actually the 9th floor where that shift happens. So Broadway Housing has some, on the north here, has some offices, and it's also where we have on the left, kind of in this zone, a kind of community space that can be used both for residents, you know, celebrating birthday parties or having book clubs, but also, as Broadway Housing does very well, they curate kind of community events where the community can come up in here and use it. They use it for everything from kind of after school workshops, you know, to local community board meetings, to you name it. And there's a terrace there also, which gives great north views. A kind of section here, you can see the band of glass kind of here in the middle. That's exactly where that shift happens and where that 9th floor is. And then here is that 2nd floor, which we kind of consider the ground floor, the plaza on the right. And this band of glass here is that 2nd floor where the preschool wraps around, that just below it, the parking entry and some of that not-for-profit rental space that we were talking about. Just working your way around. This is kind of from the east, the gas station side, the DEP parking, as I was mentioning, that kind of exchange happens on the left here. So these are lot lines, and this is why you kind of see the smaller windows here on these 2 short elevations. Then working our way around on the bottom, these are kind of the courtyards, which will show you some views. And, you know, a lot of discussion went into this facade in terms of the window sizes and the pattern. And you can see it is not a double hung window system. We're not using brick. And there's a good amount of variety. You know, there is a kind of system to the panel sizes and repetition. There's modules, but it's intended to look as it cascades going up to have some variety. And really there's no, given the floor plan and the facade pattern, there's no unit that is actually the same. So this is pretty important to us to try and kind of counter the normal model where it's a pancake and it's repetition and everything is the same, but to really give people their own, you know, residence that they can identify, that they can have their own window pattern too. And, you know, we worked hard to get larger windows and more windows than, you know, sort of is typical and is required, and really make each unit pretty special. And a lot of what happens now and being on site, which is so fantastic, is people are kind of customizing and showing their own unit and bringing us in and showing them what they did, because they really do have an individual character. This seems like a simple thing, but this is something that was a big source of discussion with so many people. First with Broadway Housing, I think they were absolutely on board and supportive, but we did a lot of community outreach, a lot of community board meetings here. And the discussion about what kind of design should happen for affordable housing, I think is pretty far behind what it could be. And so a lot of the work that has to be done is, of course, architecture and the design and costs and construction, but it's also kind of changing people's mindsets about what a building should be, affordable housing should be. We had several people who said to us that having windows of different sizes is going to make the community unstable, that people can't handle that, that only wealthy people could handle that kind of thing. This is a crazy attitude in 2020 to have, but we had a lot of these discussions, and a lot of what the work has, you know, that expands outside of architecture is really talking to people about that, educating them, and going through the process of what that could be like. I think a lot of the people who were the most vocal critics early on kind of came back to us after it was built and said, you know, they really came around after they could see it. But I think for a lot of people, it's a little hard to imagine that you could do something else. And then these are, as we start to talk about the facade and the materiality of the building, these are really, other than the top left, which is, you know, everybody should know the Louis Sullivan Guarantee building in Buffalo, but all the other images are really just, you know, context pictures from the immediate 4-block area around. It has a rich history of beautiful architecture and brownstones and ornament and carved terracotta. And we are not at a price point where we can afford that. However, we, you know, really want to make sure that we can have a building with dignity and craft that could be at this level, that could, you know, relate to it. And so we tried to see if we could take contemporary building practice at scale, and if we can infuse some of this kind of ornament and some of kind of this love and craft into it. So that was really the inspiration. And then also in our research, I'll get kind of hearing a thematic here, but we have a lot of this kind of background research that infuses it into the design. Was a discovery of these heritage roses. So this is pretty specific to this area. There was a larger New York area of heritage roses that would be displayed and farmed, but particularly in this area in Sugar Hill and Harlem, there were certain varieties. And there was a great kind of research paper that had just come out that we kind of dove into that was all about how they had these specific heritage roses, in the same way that you kind of have the trend of heirloom tomatoes or something like that, that would be displayed and farmed here. So this is how we started having the kind of thematic of roses on the facade as a kind of nod. Some of these are now being grown again and being brought back, but the building was about a way to connect to that kind of history, which was really stunning and beautiful. So we developed a kind of facade pattern that had a kind of vining or cascading of some of these roses. And we then tried to work through that in terms of the precast panels of having texture in and out. So you can see here some of the samples that we worked through. And it's kind of almost like a halftone pattern. It literally is engraved and embossed to have the depth to it. So on sometimes you're seeing it with the weather and it's very, you know, muted gray and you don't really see the roses, and other times when it's raining or when the sun is raking it, they really pop out. And part of the dynamism here was really that the building, as you went around, would look different at different times and have a kind of animation to it, and liveliness to it that you could live with, which would be really stunning. This is the building kind of on the bottom left, just to show it in the larger context. And you can see some of the other kind of typical housing projects there to the right. here again, in its context with the kind of greenery, we are very fortunate that it's sort of just to the north of this is the start of the Harlem Greenway. So there's some amazing views both to the south, but also to the north. And then you can see in form, we have a kind of sawtooth pattern from the building. And really that was about relating to things like this, which in this case is just a block up, but you see it all throughout this neighborhood, which is effectively a kind of bay window and a sawtooth pattern that's happening. And so it was really a way of, for us, inserting windows in there and getting some of these, breaking up the kind of mass of the building, because just by the nature of the program and the scale of building, it obviously is quite big. But you can see here on the side, these little returns all have windows, and it's about, we're not in a position where we're able to have apartments with exposure on two sides, but by able to turn the corner, these little gestures get you views of the river and get some air circulation that's really helpful and bring more light in. So it was about kind of breaking down the scale and getting some of that dynamism in there that's also relating to the context of the neighborhood. Here you see some of the roses pop out and kind of punch windows coming through. A couple more shots here. And the precast, in terms of production on site, was a way to get scale and some of that kind of craft that I was talking about earlier. That was really beautiful. We were able to kind of bring that up here as we work our way around. You can see this is the shift at the 9th floor of the building and the terrace on the right there. Another one. And a detail. We also did, some of this is just about the kind of materiality of the architecture, but doing a heavy acid wash on these panels was important to us to try and bring out some of that materiality. You can see some of the silica and stuff that is there. So at a big scale, we could kind of get that. That 2nd floor is where the preschool is, and it was important for us for this read of this, what's very, kind of heavy up above is floating on this glass plane. And that was really came out of also a study of all the preschools that we did and visited around the area. Here you can see the plaza used as a farmer's market. It's become a kind of zone where they can do different things. Some of the plaza shots. 9th floor, this is a view of some of their offices, and kind of coming down into the classroom. So we did visit a good amount of preschools. It's the first time we had done a preschool. We went to Italy to kind of study the Reggio Emilia school system, which has a great kind of system. It's all about color palette and integrating design in a certain way. And then also, of course, we looked at a lot of New York schools. And New York preschools, there's some exceptions to this, but are generally in the leftover spaces in the basements because the kids don't complain about not having windows or having outdoor space. They're not the highest profit driver, so they're often in a leftover space. And it was great that Broadway Housing let us effectively put this on the 2nd floor where we could give all classrooms, there are 8 here, kind of floor to ceiling glass. You can see as the slope drops off, these sort of start at ground level at the plaza, but because of the steep slope of the site, they have a great view out and there's nobody outside kind of peeking in. So we were able to get some really great natural light into all these rooms. And a lot of this kind of came out of working with their education director, Charlene Melville, who's really fantastic. There are 8 classrooms and they're always paired up with a kind of bathroom pod, just like this. And it was really about having one classroom being able to hear the other classroom. So some of it comes out of the pedagogy that she developed, that was when kids are kind of isolated in the classroom, they're not starting to understand at that age group that there are other things going on, but they still need to focus. So by pairing up some of these classrooms, as you kind of see here, you have the central toilet, but it allows for some acoustic transparency between the two that they kind of work through their curriculum and talk about, which is interesting. They're also obviously just being able to get in spaces here for interior where they have things like yoga and not just classroom spaces was important. And then we were fortunate to be able to do 2 courtyards out here. Most preschools, and Sugar Hill does as well, go to the nearby parks and playgrounds, which is great, but being able to have their own kind of enclosed safe space where they can work in their courtyards, have stuff that stays up, do little igloos and make things and do some gardening with the planters there was really important. So we're lucky to have that. And there's also a kind of shortcut to the Children's Museum that happens there. A couple views here. And then this is the kind of courtyard to the museum. So the kids get special access to come into the Children's Museum. And I realize I'm running a little long, so let me flip through some of these. These are going into the museum. The real idea of the museum here is it is a ticketed museum at a kind of affordable rate, but we worked very hard to make sure that when you enter, you get a view of the art in the gallery, and your ticket threshold is kind of pushed back so that you can very quickly even go there upstairs and hang out, have a coffee eventually, and hang out in the courtyard. And it can be really a hub for the community without buying a ticket, obviously. And then as you make your way downstairs, this is the skylight, which is really bringing natural light down into about 30 feet below. That's the stair coming down. So there's a little hangout up here. You can go into the courtyard there and wait for people or just meet people. And then down below, everything is scaled, on the children's side. So this was really a discussion about not having a children's museum that is a playground, because most children's museums are, which having 2 kids, it's fantastic. And that's an important thing that we all need. But there's also space, and what was great about the discussion here, there's space for a kind of museum that actually, really does still have art at a high level that the kids are engaged with. And it's not only a kind of playground, jungle gym kind of environment. So this really was a look at how you could make a...
Very nice, and a big mouth. You do have a big ass.
So this really was looking at how you could make a proper gallery space, but still geared to kids. So they have an amazing artist in residence program where every year they have an artist in residence. So in the back, there's a studio. And the kids are involved in the interview process. So these are the kids from the preschool just upstairs. They interview all the kind of 4 or 5 finalists, and the kids have a say. They do a workshop with them, and the kids have a say in who the artist is. And then part of the deal of the Artist in Studio is that they do a monthly kind of workshop and do kids activities, which are here. So as you go through, we have a whole series of gallery spaces that are formal, some with climate control, but also things like workshops, as you can kind of see in the distance here, where there's obviously also making space, so the kids can be involved and really do lots of work. These have become kind of a hub for the community, after school programs, and the kids are kind of not only doing art, but obviously there's been a lot of great things to see in charcoal drawings and print drawings of the building, them making their own architecture of the building. It's been really fun to be involved with and to see how that kind of process has evolved and how they're inspired by the building. Here is at the ground floor of the basement of that museum. You can see how this is kind of the gallery to our left and this is kind of bringing in natural light. And part of this is also being able to do storytelling and performance. So, they don't have the money for a proper stage or theater, but being able to do little shifts like this that also relate to some of the program elsewhere allows this to be a kind of natural stage. And they do performances or film screenings here, which is great. That's the Artist Studio residence in back. And then there's some formal galleries that really do have the kind of museum level climate control. And you can see here, there's a sort of higher level of art. This is a great kind of trade with the Studio Museum, where you can see some of the works on loan from the Studio Museum here in this gallery, which is really fantastic. In the residences, really the thematic, other than the show, was about trying to get rich materials in here. So, it may not seem like much, but, typical materials in here would be VCT tile, vinyl, not being very sustainable. The metric is about what's the cheapest material you can get in here. And so in a lobby like this, trying to have things like a walnut wood paneling, we have some brass and bronze detailing. In the apartments, you can see there's porcelain stone here. So these are things that try to like patina and wear well over time, and have some character and life to them as much as we can. So we made trade-offs elsewhere in order to try and make sure that where the body is, where people are living, it feels like a fantastic and beautiful home that, at any level you would want to be in. Here you get a little sense of a long corridor, but that little perspective shift I think I was talking about earlier. And very simple interiors inside, but everyone has a different window pattern. But you can see things like hardwood floors, which is, usually not the case in a price point like this. So just making sure that, again, there's a kind of materiality and light to all of these spaces. And some of the windows are small, like on the left, they're lot line windows, but then on the right, you get larger views. And one of the greatest things about the project for us now is coming back and people bringing us into their homes, and everybody, of course, has tricked it out in all different ways. You know, people like this, there's a real need for a lot of kind of, you know, musicians in particular who were working in thriving community in the past, but, you know, became homeless and now are having their first home again, which is just fantastic to see. So kind of people bringing it in and tricking it out in their own way. Then some of the views. This is the 9th floor terrace. As you come up there, you can see sort of the backside. That's that DEP parking lot I was mentioning, the skylight and some of these terraces. And then that band, and I think we have one more shot you can see at night. So sorry for going over a little bit, but appreciate the time.
Yeah, Mark, that was a fantastic talk. Really wonderful how you framed also at the beginning. I'm actually really curious too about the nonprofit that you were working with, but to see what you did, and also some of the just the sort of subtle moments in terms of the home is fascinating, as well as the story you talked about in terms of the parking plaza. That's really, really fantastic. So much, I think, to talk about here. And I'm really curious to come back to like this cost issue too, which, you know, affordability is a core point, a key part of this. So that was amazing. Really, really nice talk. Thank you. Super nice. So let's, why don't we go on to Manuel Bailo as our last speaker, and we'll come back because I know there's going to be a ton of questions for all of our speakers. But I'm going to give you the floor, Manuel.
Sure, yes. Let me see. Can you see my screen? Yes?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's great.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to explain some of the housing projects that we have done in our office. I'm going to explain two public housing coming from two competitions that we did some years ago and that we won, and then we built that buildings. And then also I would like to explain another project that has been built recently that I think it's also I think it's a way of explaining what or the effects of the type of the public housing that that it's built in Europe. When Matthew asked me to explain the main goals of these projects that I'm going to explain, I thought it was nice to have this, I don't know, this picture, because in some way helped me to explain, I think, the main ideas of our work. This is Tantine, as you know, but Tantine is always, when he's visiting different countries, he's always dressing a new and different dress. So in our projects, I think every project is, we try to give a specific answer to the context. We try to design a specific skin, which is absolutely directly related with the place. And of course, we always consider the urban context. I think our work is absolutely related with the place, and it's a clear answer. What we understand is the demand of the place. That is related with of course, with the facade, as you will see in these different examples that I'm going to explain, that everyone has a different facade, a different DD, a different detail of the facade, and everyone has a different volume too. And of course, I think there's another issue, which I think is also important, is the question about the sustainability. But it's not about just to be responsible about the energy expenses demand. It's also how to work with this idea of the sustainability, creating, I think, spaces, which probably is the most interesting thing. So it's not just to be responsible, which for sure we have to be, but finally, I think every one of these projects that you will see now in a minute, I think they are all of them. I think that there is an effort. I don't know. I think we try to, from this idea of responding to the climate, to the sustainability being, I think, different in every context, to define always a kind of a, let's say, to define a special space too, also related with this dressing condition, which is for sure is important. And finally, I think, of course, there's an important issue when we do public housing, which is the budget, for sure. In all of these projects, but also you will see in the last project that I'm going to show you, the structure, it's really simple. So the structure is always something that is a really clear guide to the project. So the structure is something that is absolutely agreed, is a repetition. And then, of course, there is an effort about the materiality to define a specific materiality, which has to be a really, really low cost. And for sure, we have to control the finishing. But I'm sure that you will see in the project that I'm going to explain you. So the first one is this one in the city of Granollers. As you see here, I don't know if I made my maths correctly, not trespassing the euros to dollars and the meters, the square meters to square feet. But I think if you look to the euros, I'm sure it's correct. So as you see, it's really, really low. That means that the effort to build these buildings, it's really high for the architects for sure. But I think also what is interesting that all of these projects, these two projects that I'm going to explain you, are competition. So that means that for young architects in Europe, it's an opportunity to build housing public buildings. In this case, the context, again, I think it's really important. So this you see is a section of the building that has this shape that is, you will see it changing a little bit, trying to create a special different types of spaces around the facade, with the idea of trying to connect perpendicular to the main street the views that you have with the landscape, which I think is what is interesting. Here you can see a diagram. So this is the building. It's a really small housing project, this one. And is placed in this small city close to Barcelona called Granollers, where there's the most interesting or the most important thing is one main street. And then there are some other less important streets that are perpendicular to this main street. So that means that the village, the city, grows around this main street. And these are other secondary streets that are really directly connected with the landscape. That's why we wanted to make this kind of a dress that is folding in some way and trying to get some perpendicular views to the landscape. That was the idea of the competition. This is a drawing that we made for the competition. And here are some sections. There is a porch that you will see that it was a policy that was coming from the urban policy. And then you see here the facade is moving a little bit one facade to the other. From here, let's see another section. So you can see the facade that is changing and moving, and here the back facade too. This is a really small patio that we have on the back. And here's the facade. So this is how the facade is built with a really, as I said, a really low budget. This is made with brick, and we decided to use brick because the buildings that are really close to that building is built with brick. So we thought it was beautiful to keep using the same type of material, but a little bit different. Okay? This is the other facade, which is again a really cheap one. It's made with aluminum and is the party wall. So it's the end of the facade. Okay, so that's the ground floor. This is the porch. As you see here, we have two small commerces, the stair, the backyard, and the plants. The plants are really they're really small, but what we made, as you see here, and also the structure, as you see, is really simple. So we have a really a core here that is the structure, and then the simple columns on the facade. But the distribution of the apartment, it's the idea of keeping this idea of the walls, that finally there's this aluminum wall that defines one of the facades, as you will see, really cheap one. But the idea is to keep this idea of the brick getting inside of the distribution. Then there is a main common area with the dining room, with the kitchen. And what I think is beautiful is that the plan goes from one side, from one facade to the other facade. And then every apartment has a different type of a balcony or a gallery. And then that's also happened on the back facade. That's another plan. So you can see that the facade is changing. So every apartment has a different view to the perpendicular idea of looking to the landscape. This is the building when it was completed. So here you can see the brick building that is close to the one that the build that we made. We use the brick. Again, here's this kind of a party wall, which is, you see, it's a really cheap one. And we made this type of construction, which, well, as you see here, trying to get the idea that I was saying in the beginning. I think in this case is the idea of creating the skin, but at the same time looking to the landscape perpendicularly, but creating different types of spaces. This is a facade that is a facade that for sure it's really good for because it's a double facade, it's ventilated facade. It's a curtain wall facade. So it's a really good answer to the energy expenses demand. This is the back facade. Here you can see the brick. This is also a public housing project, and the main facade to that important or secondary street. The facade that makes these movements. The balconies, the different. There's a terrace. How the facade is changing. And this is the party wall, but that is also a facade because it's facing one street. And you can see here also the colors of this idea of the brick also is inside the building. So from the outside, you can see also this freedom inside the building. This is this facade. This is from the back. And this is when you see these mountains, so perpendicularly, you can see these beautiful views. And this is to the other side. So finally, you have these views through these balconies to the street on the other side. This is the entrance. And as I said in the beginning, so this is a really big effort because for the budget that we used to build these kind of buildings, it's not easy, but it's possible. Here you can see the interior of these apartments that are really simple, really, the finishing is really simple. Here we just were able, well, I think the distribution works really well. So this is the kitchen, and then, and here you can see the dining room and the entrances to the dormitories. The second project is another housing project, a public one that we built also some years ago. And in this case, as you see again, in this case, the budget is lower and the numbers are totally true. So this is not, it's really difficult to, as I said, to build with these really low budgets. In this case, the building is placed at the end of the city, at the end of, I think it's practically in the border of the city. It's also, again, a competition. And in this case, the building it's placed, I think, in a really strange place because this is the old city or the small city. This is Sant Eugeni de Berga, again, close to Barcelona. And the building is facing to a green area on the main facade. But the thing is that this main area, this main green park, is facing west. So the orientation is really bad. But at the same time, I think we were feeling the pressure of the old city on the back. So the main idea of this project, again, really cheap one, was this idea of creating this skin, or this kind of skin that it's also, I think, the design of one type of a space. Was the idea of designing this really simple balcony. As you see, the balcony, the main decision was to site just 30 centimeters lower than the interior of the apartment. So that allows you, when you are inside, the railing is not blocking the view. And at the same time, the railing, you will see in the pictures, are designed with the idea of making kind of a bristle, because we are facing west. So what we wanted is to, as I said, to control the energy expenses demand. So this contradiction between facing west, but at the same time, we wanted to look to this beautiful park. We designed this facade, this scheme, designing this simple balcony, protecting from one side from the sun, but at the same time opening the building to this park. Here you see that there are different types of railings, different types of, there are some holes also in the balcony. So sometimes you can have light passing through this. Here you see the plan that we made. So this is the building. This is the back facade, and this is the one that is facing to this park. The apartments are well, as here are the distributions are really effective, let's say. So well, there are three different types of apartments. So the ones that are in the corner, the ones that are in the center, of course, they always, except one that are placed in the center, are having the double ventilation from one side to the other. This is the drawing of this facade. Here with the railing, you will see that the railing is a really simple design made with an aluminum with different types of finishing and colors. And then because there's these holes in the plan, the effect of that holes creates this shade on the facade. So finally, we are protecting this facade that is facing west, but at the same time, we are opening the building to the park. So here we see some images from the park with this idea of trying to connect that building. Also, you can see the buildings on the back with the roof. So here was this idea of trying to connect that building directly with the park, painting in different colors the facade. And here you see that there are different types of transparencies, of different grades of transparency of the railings. Here are the railings. This is made with aluminum, really cheap again. So here you can see sometimes are absolutely solid and sometimes are transparent. Is from the back. That's also important when we design public housing. Always there's this important discussion about the parking, and in the competitions, it's really valuable not to build a basement because that's finally it's really expensive. So this is the parking. This is one of the corners of the building. So here you can see, I think it's reached this building with this kind of spaces that I tried to explain in the beginning. So the idea is how to design these facades, these schemes, trying to adapt the schemes to every context, and designing and considering for sure the climate, the solar orientation, and trying to create and designing a specific kind of spaces. So I think they are rich in the type of spaces. So this is a balcony from one of these apartments. These are the balconies. These are looking to the top on one of the balconies. And again, so the interior of these apartments are really, really simple and really cheap. Everything is white. The kitchen. This is the main dining room and living room. And here's where you can see, this effect of the step, with the relationship in the interior and the balconies, with these different types of railings and the green park in the front. So after, I think these kind of projects that they try to work with a really low budget, I think the privates, they started I think that's what is happened to us. The private developers are started to ask to the architects who built with these low budgets to also work for them. And they want to, of course, to try to build this type of architecture and try to bring this type of of architecture to also to the private developer. And this is what I'm going to show you. This is the last, which, as you see, it's a little bit higher the budget, but this is still absolutely, I think, really, really low. These are two other buildings that we finished some years ago. Here again, so the idea of controlling the facade and designing this scheme related with the context, with the climate, and in this case also what we made it was we changed the policies of the urban policies to have a bigger balconies around the facades, with this idea of trying to create spaces around the facade for controlling and for adapting the housing to the context and to the climate. Here are the plans. This is well, I'm going to go a little bit faster because I think yes. So I just have five more minutes. So here you can see the balconies are big, and what I think it's beautiful, it's this kind of a buffer that we design on the west facade to control and to help to the apartment to control again the energy expenses demand. But the main thing is to create this buffer around the building. Those are balconies because are looking and facing to the interior of the block, and these ones are facing the street. This is one of the facades. This is this coaching. You see with what we made, it was to design these concrete columns that are hanging these shades. And this is this buffer that is controlling the demand of the apartment. This is the facade that is facing the interior of the block. This is this facade and interior, the axis. And this is how this apartment looks like from the inside. So these are these galleries, these buffers where you can stay, you can have, you can have these beautiful places, I think, for living. This is one of the bedrooms, for example, facing to this street. These are these big terraces facing, and this is the second one, this building here, which is a little bit higher than the public one that we saw. I'm going to pass really fast. In this case, there was a commercial block that was has to be facing the facade, the street. And what we made it was to separate this commercial block to have these patios. So then we had a duplex here and then a simplex on the top. So the section is not just something that is one section and then this is a street. It's a section that is changing along the building. So here this commercial bar here with the corner. These are the duplex with the patios. And this is what it's happened today. So with I think the effect also that of this public housing is provoking to the private ones. This is the facade, and I'm going to pass really fast. These other images from the back. Some of these patios inside, the duplex. Yes, having this type of terraces. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. That's awesome. Fantastic. Really incredible projects. And I kept thinking to myself as you were speaking, these are really cheap materials of various, the first two projects, and yet it's a testament to, how the architect of thinking like how amazing those spaces look. So it was really it's fantastic. Also, when Mark was talking about Sugar Hill, I mean, these are astonishingly beautiful details that you can see. So really, really amazing, and I think it's so interesting too to look at the last two talks in relation to what Robert and Moses were talking about at the beginning. So we want to hand this quickly off to our students because that's the key part here, is to bring their conversation questions into the speakers. So I'll leave that to Katie, and thank you again. Amazing talks. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you for such amazing presentations. As Matthew, I was very much impressed by the innovation on material and the considerations of site. And I very much look forward to the questions of our students who came together as a group and put in hundreds of questions, but we asked them to pick two so that we can all have a discussion on the beautiful work that you put forward. So we're going to begin the discussion with two students, Corey and Sierra, who had prepared two questions for you to frame the discussion and begin the conversation. Sierra, over to you.
Hi, Corey. I'll actually let you start.
Hey, again, my name is Corey Day. Thank you again for presenting today. That was amazing presentation. The first question that we have is, how do you judge the success of a project? The residents' opinion of their new home or the surrounding community's opinion of the new building in their neighborhood?
And I would add to the question is to all the speakers, Corey, or is that to address to one particular speaker?
To all the speakers.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'll go into my role as the urban designer and say that I think that I personally would put a premium on how the building ultimately is perceived as being part of a kind of a larger neighborhood fabric. Obviously, not just in terms of its contextual massing and so on, or acontextual massing if it's some other kind of statement, but also in terms of program. So I think this is where the project that Mark presented is interesting, because having these other programs mixed in with the housing program, to me, sort of makes the way one would evaluate the success of this project is being well beyond what just how the residents feel about living in it, as important as that is.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that. I think that's really well said and really true. So for us, it sort of happened in different phases. So one of the most striking moments I had was, we were just finishing construction and people had started moving in, and a few residents saw me on site, and I had been on site, doing punch listing and things, and they knew that I was working on the project, and they pulled me in and they just said, I want to thank you so much. Can I bring you into my apartment and show you what I've done? And there's special moments like that. So it sort of started obviously from a understanding that first and foremost that those residents are having that experience. But I think exactly as Robert's saying, how it interacts with the community, and unfortunately in a project like Sugar Hill, for all the reasons Robert's saying, with the museum, as that became online and became public, residents kind of moved in first, and then they got their legs with the museum, and that started opening up. We saw a second wave of community being able to use it, and that is just obviously so powerful. And then being able to have things like farmers markets there and really get engaged, those things take some time, and was really powerful. During the process, it was important to us to bring the community along because they were part of the process. This is in a location where the community board had never unanimously agreed and approved on a project. And this is it's a tall building. And there's a lot of lower scale buildings there. There's some other tall buildings a few blocks away, but there's always concern in a kind of, especially in a historic district like this, with that history there. So we had 7 community board meetings, and really each one of those was tailored to everything from looking at the facade and the materiality and talking to them about it, to the windows, to the preschool, to everything about it, the kind of public spaces. And so through that process, we were kind of able to bring, and a lot of them were very critical. This is not a community board meeting that had ever agreed on anything. So it was a process, is why we had so many. But at the end of that process, we were the first project ever in that to have a kind of unanimous approval, and we were pretty proud of that. And that sort of set the stage, for down the road when the building did start to open up, to be able to see community engage. So it sort of, I guess the short answer to your question is all of the above. Like it obviously matters at the apartment scale, but then also, now seeing the preschool there and those younger kids being inspired and drawing the building, it happens at multiple levels. And I think the more we can get projects that are able to, inspire different generations and different groups, at sometimes very disparate groups, it's helpful. So that's often what we strive for, and why we're doing not just apartments or affordable housing, but things like public spaces and museums, because you are able to get lots of different kinds of people. And it's not that we have to please everybody, but that that some of them are engaged in, in doing its part. So.
Can I just follow up on that? That's interesting. But you mentioned also 2 things: the farmers market and then the gallery. How much of that community engagement, and this speaks a little bit to Moses talking about maintenance and how you as an architect, you complete the project, but then it's life afterwards. How did that work in terms of, because the success of the museum is the curators and the exhibition and then the school. What did that involve?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as all these things, they take time. So what was fantastic about Broadway Housing is they and what you don't really see in the photos is that they've been very good about trying to find overlap between these different programs. So even in the housing portion, the people who are working sort of at the front desk, they have and who are doing sort of the security patrols of the building and the halls, are living in that space. And so they have a very low rate of kind of incidents or crime, if you will, because everybody in that building, it's sort of like a big house. It's like being in a studio. On day one, there's a lot of different people and you don't necessarily know everybody, but probably come month 1 or whatever it is, 6 weeks in, like you guys know each other, and when somebody from outside studio is coming in and like you haven't seen them before. And it's very much that vibe there. You have the 16-year-old who is just getting their first job, who's working at the front desk. You have other people patrolling, and that starts to trickle into the museum too, and things like the farmers market. They are kind of all hands on deck. So they're supportive in that they're also not just having a living space, but starting to people who are like working down in the museum and start to have overlap. And that then extends to the community, where they have really good ties, where they'll do things like after school programs, and that starts to come in. So, and continue to this day to really try and find ways that we could connect. We're talking to them about doing workshops with them. And, I often am there visiting the school, and a lot of our discussions now are about ways that we can help in our practice, whether it's dealing with the preschool and do workshops or things like that at the museum. So it's for us a relationship that we really like to see extend, because they're doing really inspiring work.
Manuel, or
I said,
Well,
Moses?
I believe
No,
and framing.
No, sorry. Excuse me. No, I was just going to add something to what Mark explained. So I do know about the building that you built in the Sugar Hill building. I didn't understand till your presentation the idea of the facade that has this shape that is making this. Let me see. I don't know how to make it. This thing that makes like this, I didn't understand that in plan till your presentation, and I thought it was really beautiful after your presentation, because I understood that there was this relationship of the dimension of the plot, the parcellation, with the other buildings that you have really close, and the idea of the facade that is moving and taking the rhythm, the urban rhythm of the buildings close to the huge building, I thought it was beautiful to how the building is integrated through the parcel and through using the parcellation to the morphology of the building. And I didn't understood that. Sorry, because I haven't visited. I'm sure that if you visit the building, it's something that you can really, really catch really fast. But in your presentation, I understood that, and I thought it was really, really interesting how the parcel helps to, so the urban design helped to define the building. I thought that was nice to extend the building into the city, although the scale of the building is totally different.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, it's something that we're often trying to do in the work, which is, you know, I think obviously as contemporary architects, there's a for the layperson, there's an idea that like modern contemporary architecture is cold and doesn't relate to the history. And so we're often trying to find ways of, you know, mining the ideas and forms of past projects, but obviously not replicating them, but still pushing architecture forward. So for us, that was a way, you know, even at a 13-story building, to have that kind of relationship and trying to do that in a modest way. So appreciate that.
Oh, in our work, as I explained, we always try to connect the building directly with the context, always, no?
Yeah, I mean, that's really clear in the balcony project with the kind of the beautiful picture of the landscape in the green, and then its connection to those kind of cascade and the elevation of that, of the balconies and the facade there was stunning.
Yeah, thank you. So that's, I think, what our work try to do. So just not to consider as an object, is to consider the building as something that tries to be connected with the city, with the context, and at the same time, for sure, if it is possible, also to try to make the place better. No, if you have the opportunity to have other type of programs, not just the housing, which is the case of Sugar Hill, that's for sure better, no? Because it's not just the housing, it's also something else that helps.
Mm-hmm. It really helps. Yeah, yeah, so true, so true.
Sierra, we're ready for your second question.
Okay, our next question is, some cities have mixed affordable and workforce housing, combining homelessness, low income, and middle class needs together. Would this approach sufficiently address the complexities of the debate, or are cities more successful when they address these issues separately?
I can try to take this one if that's okay. And maybe this is where I should have pulled up the earlier slide that we kind of skipped, detailing all of the kind of scale of the different types of affordable housing.
No, Moses, why don't I pull it up now?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that okay, Mona?
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Thanks.
Okay. Hold on.
I would say that the provision of affordable housing is even more complex than that. And furthermore, the thing you have to realize is that direct government assistance is not a way that any city, or direct government control and kind of building and placement and regulation is not a way that any city in you know, I would say at least a democratized world operates. What government does is it fills in the needed gaps in the housing market, and that gap varies by city, and that approach varies by country and government. But everywhere starts with kind of a base of a market system, and then the parts that the market don't meet, the government tries to step in on. And so it really depends on what the need is in a particular city. And on a political level, what you know, the political pressure is to meet certain needs. You know, there's in sometimes we hear a lot about, you know, I will say the narrative in New York up until maybe about 10 years ago was, you know, the rich have enough options and the poor have enough options because of public housing and Section 8, and it's the middle class, whatever that happens to mean, where we should build affordable housing. And this is because middle class affordable housing in New York had gotten increasingly you know, I would say the standard of living for the middle class in the city in terms of bang for your buck had grown less and less and less over the previous couple decades. So there was a lot of political pressure for that kind of narrative. So there's really, and I want to point this out, kind of two separate scales of, you know, quote unquote, affordable housing. One is the ownership scale. And this ownership goes from, you know, government, you know, straight public government ownership to kind of a community land trust CDC model where you have a community ownership, meaning, you know, community appointees on the boards of the CDC or the CLT. You kind of have nonprofit regulated where things are owned by a nonprofit corporation with a lot of government regulation. Then you have for-profit regulation, which is a little less kind of public because there's a profit motive to get out of that regulation. You have regulated home ownership projects where, you know, you're now down to individual ownership, and then you have the free market. So there's really kind of a sliding scale of the public interest in ownership. And there's also a sliding scale of affordability. And the two generally track each other, but not 100%. You know, so public housing is the most public and also the most affordable because it's targeted to low income folks and it's income contingent, meaning you only pay a certain percentage of your income. You have Section 8, also income contingent, but privately, you know, privately owned. Then you get into regulatory programs in which the income the rent you pay is not contingent on your existing income, but it's set kind of according to the average of the larger income of low income folks in the region. So it's kind of like targeted to low income folks and the rents are set because of that. Then you have, you know, some regulation like HDFC co-ops where you don't have price limits, but you have limits on income. And what this does is it leads to a lot of loopholes like cash rich, income poor buyers, you know, retirees and folks like that. You know, up to rent stabilized rents where there's no income targeting of who can live there and rents aren't set by what the larger market can afford. They're essentially set by what the operating costs for the building are and the increases as such. I'm not going to get into rent stabilization. That's a very simplified view of it. Over to the free market. And so you kind of have those two sliding scales. And in response to your question, you know, it is a political question. It is where you consider the need to be, where you consider it appropriate for the government to step in to help provide a housing market gap and where that political pressure is. And it varies. Right now, the political pressure is to repair public housing. 10 years ago, that is not where the political pressure was. It was more kind of in this area, the HDFC co-op, you know, co-op regulated, people kind of like those programs, you know, in the 70s and 80s. You know, and it's kind of moved towards a lot of pressure for public housing, CLT, CDCs. You know, LIHTC was very popular in the early mid 2000s. So it kind of depends. You know, it is at the end of the day, affordable housing is a zero-sum game. It really, you know, and it's very hard to find, you know, win-win-wins for everybody. It is, if you want to do more affordable housing, it costs more money. If you want to do more housing, it costs more money. If you want to do bigger apartments, it costs more money. It is just a matter of, you know, how much government subsidy you want to put in for what kind of housing you want to build. There's some other things. There's, you know, inclusionary zoning, which kind of leverages the market. There's other things that you can do, but very much 95% of it is just a political decision on how much you want to put into what kind of programs.
Moses, that's a very interesting point, which will lead us to the next question we have from Gordon.
So I guess this question is directed towards Robert and Moses, but it is open to everyone. So imagining a world where Bill de Blasio hops on the phone with you guys tomorrow and says, I've been hanging out at the Union Square climate clock and staring down the barrel of like imminent climate death. I've decided we can't really afford to build more buildings anymore. Like we just really have to like focus on alterations, additions, and is there a way forward with that approach to housing? In particular in relation, I know that the RPA just released the Be My Neighbor report. So yeah, I guess asking about.
Sure. Moses, I think you should take that because of all the work you've done about sort of invisible housing, you know, invisible density and so on.
Yeah, and let me address a couple of things in the chat. I guess the first one is the concept of like workforce housing. Workforce housing is a really interesting brand that means upper middle class housing. Low income people work. And I really think it's interesting that workforce housing has taken in that kind of weird class signifier that and affordable housing has taken in a different class signifier. And you know, all of the class signifiers in all of this language are very, you know, are interesting for their kind of subconscious worming their way into the nomenclature of things. I think mixed income housing and mixed income neighborhoods are good. They're how neighborhoods work. They let different types of people live together and get to jobs, you know, have different jobs, needed jobs in areas, you know, be able to access different workforces and things like that. I think the ability of cities to intentionally build mixed income communities is difficult. You know, I think cities try, but I think that you have to overcome a lot of ingrained classism and racism in people that expresses itself in the housing market. It doesn't mean I don't think that it should be attempted, but I think it's difficult, and I think it is much, much more complicated than saying cities need to create mixed income neighborhoods and mixed income housing. The co-location of public resources is really interesting. There are a lot of good examples of that. There was a really good, and libraries are the biggest one. There's a lot of good library redevelopments where you're taking a one-story library and you're making the library a better, bigger library, the ground floor, and doing housing, mixed income, et cetera, housing on top of it. There's one in Sunset Park that's a really good example. I don't even mind the one in Brooklyn Heights, although some folks don't like the one in Brooklyn Heights. It's you know, the harder ones are schools. The debate about schools is everybody always wants a school as part of a new development, which is fine and good. The developer provides the school space. They don't run the school or anything like that. And what ends up happening is the school construction authority hates this because the school construction authority wants to build schools according to their own demand models of, you know, where students are going, where there's going to be more students and everything like that. They don't want to be told, here, you know, we have the opportunity to do a new development here. They've offered school space. Now you got to build, you know, which is raw space. It's not a built out school or anything. Here's where you're building your next school. You know, so it kind of takes away that ability to kind of have a comprehensive master plan of school space. And, you know, the discussion has been moving a lot towards the need to do comprehensive citywide plans. You have a pretty decent comprehensive citywide approach when it comes to school space. And, you know, these kind of like one-off development proposals where you do a new school kind of fucks with it. It's not to say, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. On that point, on the mixed development, I think it would be a great segue to transition to another question from Jacob on the Sugar Hill development. And just as a note, we have a lot of excited students with a lot of questions.
All right.
We have so many questions in very little time. So the more we can have the students participate, the better. So
you should be shameless. You should be shameless about cutting us off.
I'll do better.
You can get to the retrofit question. Sorry.
No, I thought this was a really good segue to the Sugar Hill development with a mixed use in the school. So Jacob, over to you.
I'll actually let Abigail ask our first question. Hi. This question, yeah, it's for Mark. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really great. So you mentioned varied window type, size, and placement, providing feelings of individuality. Can you speak to the importance of emphasizing individuality in affordable housing and how your strategies fostered that? And can you speak to the trade-offs that were made budget-wise in order to foster individuality and feelings of ownership? And lastly, did they work? Are the residents satisfied?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Happy to talk about it a bit. So I think it's extremely important, and particularly given the context, right? Which is that at the end of the day, as designers or as architects and working on these projects, you know, it's easy to kind of think about the metrics and the numbers and how many housing we need and what needs to happen and cost per square foot. But, you know, there are stating the obvious, but like there are people here. And I think too often in the kind of matrix and spreadsheets of getting things to work, for all the reasons that Moses is talking about, you know, that those are real. Like it is so hard to do these kinds of projects at the right price point and make it work. And those pressures are real, that I think it's often easy to forget that like there are still people living here. So it was a dumb comment, but it's really true. And I think in so much of this, it is about ultimately becoming a home. And for us also, it was about a change in scale, right? So I think as you're starting in architecture, or as we build up a practice, you know, you start small and you get to the point where you get bigger and bigger projects. And, you know, we had done that naturally, whether that was through starting to do public libraries or starting to do, you know, larger homes. But then all of a sudden getting to the scale of like a 13-story building, you know, and now we're doing kind of first skyscrapers and stuff. It's important, even in those larger projects for us, to try and find ways, there's still homes, and there's even in an urban density situation like that. And so how does the idea of a home, how does one have dignity and feel excited to come home and have their own space, even when it's in a tower, when you're getting to it from an elevator, when there's a corridor that's 100 feet long and there are other people on it, you know? I think those kinds of questions are really important and also lead to better design. So it's not that we have all the answers, there's lots of ways to do it. And I think there's lots of critiques of Sugar Hill, but for us, it was an important driver of it. And, you know, from our relationship with some of those residents here, and we have a good relationship with Ellen and talk to them all the time, you know, that the way that people got housing there was a lottery system when they opened it up. And, you know, there's 124 units, and they had, you know, off the charts in terms of people applying to get homes there. And then now, most important as any architect is always like a post-occupancy, you know, and understanding how it's working now. I think, you know, the pictures that we're kind of most proud of are those pictures we showed of people kind of modifying their apartments and living there. And those are really from them inviting us in. Those are not those are not like some kind of marketing stage op where we like ask them to come in and to the stage set. Those are genuine. We were just being really touched by them, talking to Ellen, who put us in touch, and they wanted to kind of show off what they had done. So I think, it's a long-winded way of saying I think it's really important. There's lots of ways to address it, but for us, it was pretty important. And we made some other trade-offs. You know, there are other finishes elsewhere. It's not like we got every finish we wanted, you know, and the classrooms have lots of different trade-offs. We didn't have certain glass windows into certain hallways, and, you know, all the myriad of things all throughout, like about trying to deal with compromise happens. But ultimately the core and the power of what we're able to achieve, I think, is still really, really strong. And I think a lot of times you only see one version of that from the outside. So I think in projects like this, it's often, you know, when possible, it's important, especially as students, to be able to try and get inside and see the interior experience, because I think too often, so much of it, even from like the architecture critic press, the way that these projects are talked about, I think is not too sympathetic to the reality of what actually has to happen, and is from outward in. And a lot of times really for us, like, I love the facade of Sugar Hill and the details and challenges we worked through. We didn't get everything, but there's some neat things about it. But for me, the kind of, you know, still to this day, the most interesting thing is being inside and talking to those people who are occupying it, or talking to the kids who are like engaged there. So again, a long-winded way of saying that I think it's pretty critical.
Mark, that's so great to hear that they actually invited you into their homes. It's like a really beautiful story, especially because it sounds like it was unexpected from your side, which really talks about the importance of design and quality, and seeing someone Manuel's projects and the photographs, the interior photographs are quite beautiful, Manuel. So I think the next question coming from Fatim is for you, Manuel, and I think she'll address some of those questions about domesticity and the users that are living in those environments. Fatim?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this speech today. It's really great. I have one question about environment. How does environmentally sustainable design elements impact the cost of the building, both in the construction phase, but also in the phase of inhabitants?
Well, that's the let's say the typical problem. No, so for the construction, for sure, it's more expensive to define details to control the climate of the expenses of the energy, for sure. So it's through the life of the building, finally it's cheaper. No, for the maintenance of the building, it's really cheaper. But that's also what we try to do in our projects. We are using passive ways of controlling the climate and the expenses of energy. So, for example, this project that I was explaining, the green one, the facade, that's a really cheap. That's a really cheap system of controlling the west insulation to the building and to protect the windows of the building. But for sure that when we were doing that building, we had a lot of discussions with, in this case, with administration, with the public administration, because they didn't want it. They didn't want to build that balcony, changing just the step. We had a lot of discussions just for keeping that two steps, because of course it's cheaper if you just build, simple slab, totally flat. But to change and to have just two steps, you cannot imagine the quantity of discussions that we had just for two steps, and then just to make this super simple railing with different types of aluminum perforations. But finally, I'm sure that this addition to the budget, it makes the building cheaper, because finally the energy expenses demand is lower. But it's always a battle, with the company or with the administration that is paying the building.
I want to just piggyback just very briefly. First of all, how jealous I am of the beautiful architecture. And with that, pivot to my regional perspective again, which is that a huge part of sustainability is where these things are built. Whether there is existing infrastructure and in particular transportation in the places where these things are built, and density in general. So both things need to be in play.
Also, going again, I think one of the questions, it's not always not to build something that means that is going to be, I don't know, a low cost for the environment. Sometimes to readapt, to make a restoration, it's could be more expensive than to demolish and to build again, and probably reusing the same materials that you demolished too. So I think we also have to talk about this myth that it's not necessary to build anymore. Well, I don't know. We have to use the imagination. So we can also use what we are demolishing and reusing the materials and making the buildings really cheap. The construction of the buildings really cheap too.
The parallels between what is happening in Spain and the way, Mark, you were describing your challenges in Sugar Hill development are quite interesting. So to bring it back to the US, I'm going to ask Jacob to ask one more question. Jacob?
Yeah. Yes. So Mark, we would like to know what it's like as far as from the financier side of developing affordable housing, what it's like working with a nonprofit maybe versus another private financier or the New York City Housing Authority, and how possibly the programming of the building, like the public programming of the building, is then informed or dictated by that.
Sure. It's a challenge. So, and in some ways fantastic because, I think Moses was describing earlier with the kind of process where, you have a developer with a school and they don't run that school. Fortunately, in a place like Sugar Hill, we can count on them to not only run the housing and all of that, but run the museum and run the school. And so it's meant that we've been able to, not only work with them in the early time when we were designing and programming, but still to this day and continue. So I think that I think has been one unique advantage with a place like Broadway Housing. It's been unique. And, it's maybe particular to them, but Ellen has been really interested in trying to find a model that's able to be replicated in terms of the funding. That is just an extreme challenge. I think, Moses, again, touched on many of these things and how to do it. And by no means is Sugar Hill perfectly there, but, on a project like that, they had 13 different funding sources. Some of those are absolutely available to others, and they've kind of opened up that model to show it to others, to try and have others, even if it's outside of New York, to have it be replicable. But I mean, I'd be lying, and I am not a finance person or an expert in funding those things, but I was involved enough and tangentially with them to understand how difficult that is and how they're doing, particularly, if you're doing more than just housing, where they had different funding sources for the museum and different pots of money for the preschool. Those are very different things, and Department of Health gets involved, and they all, so there's sort of 3 pots of money there. So I don't have the answers to it, but I think there were some advantages that were really a credit to Ellen and her vision and some of her experience, and I'm sure some others have that. On the other hand, you have developers that we're working with, and we do have some others that we're working with, that have other advantages in scales and things that they can leverage. So I think as architects, you're kind of mining them and seeing what their skill set is, where you can leverage that and do. But these are complex problems, and I think each one is, by no means, I don't think anybody quite has figured it out, and it's sort of trying to understand the landscape and how we can all make some positive change there. It's not easy.
Yes,
Katie,
yeah, clearly.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to sneak in a follow-up question because I think it's a really great topic to bring in the role of the developer. Because Mark, in your project, I had the impression you gave a lot of credit to the developer who agreed on moving forward with specific strategies and that are, in support of the neighborhood, in support of the district, actually, where the project is going to be located. So I made a note and said we need good developers, and even in brackets, non-profit developers. And then I had a follow-up question for Moses, like how can we convince more developers to be maybe less profit-oriented and more community-oriented? And I mean, I don't want to simplify this. I don't want to say that developers always want to make the best dollar amount, but I think this is an important component that we can design with low budget. We know this, but at the end of the day, it's also a question of the developers who are able to support this.
I mean, as far as developers go, I would focus less on trying to get profit motivated developers to be a little bit less profit motivated. There's ways to do that, and it's mostly good press. If you come up with, something that they think will build their profile, that might help. The other way to do it is to convince developer and this really only works for larger developers, is to convince them that there is a really significant long-term investment. Like, they might take a short-term hit on the profits, but you know, the neighborhood or the city or something like that will pay off in the end. But in order to do that, you know, that means that, you know, they're investing for the long term, and in the long term that means higher rents and things like that. What I would focus on instead of that is how to build the capacity of not-for-profit developers. You know, there's plenty of community development corporations, nonprofits, CLTs, folks like that. And, you know, if you can boost them into a position where they're competitive with larger for-profit developers, that really helps. There's, you know, they're less nimble, they're less capitalized, there's problems, but they have a lot of advantages also. And then the last one is, you know, there are two different ways to make profits in the development game. One is just straight fee for service. Like, you can get a developer and pay them a lot of money and they'll build a thing and turn it over to a community land trust or the government or anything like that. You know, but you gotta pay them a pretty good upfront chunk of change to do that. The other way developers make money is through controlling the asset and controlling the land. So you could, you know, you can get them to take a short-term hit, but in return for that, they're going to own the land, own the building. They're not going to want to do land leases. They're not going to want to turn anything over to a CLT. So you can balance those two things also, kind of like the short-term and long-term.
Great.
I think just a second. No. So just a short comment. I think also the way of convincing the developers will be to explain that I think the idea of comfort, I think, has changed a lot from the standards of comfort. No, I think this is something that has changed absolutely. Probably for our dads, for our granddads. What comfort means is to have beautiful bathrooms and you know, an amazing kitchens. But I think for us, for all of us, comfort means you know, I think empty spaces, or to talk about volume, talk about light, talk about things that are not expensive. And I think this is something that the developers, they must understand. And this is I think what we have to explain to them. And when you find a developer that he understands that, I think that's when the housing will change, absolutely. And I think this is something that is changing a lot right now, absolutely. Because these standards are absolutely changing, absolutely. I'm sure that for all of us that we are here in the Zoom today, what we understand for comfort is totally different from our dads.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear the challenges as a model, how you could produce affordable housing and then go down to the details of the finishes and the user and the experience back to the scale of the community. So we have a question from an alum who's joining this Zoom symposium today. So Karim, are you here?
Yeah. Hey guys.
Yes.
I had a question for Mark. Thank you for sharing work with us. Needless to say, it's very impressive and inspiring. I had a more technical question relating to the efficiencies when designing a project at this scale, where every aspect is unique, as well as being cognizant of the client's budget. My team and I are working on a LIHTC local affordable housing project here in Charlottesville that's resident-led. And the general concept is our neighborhood is, it's going to be a neighborhood of townhomes that look different from each other to blend in with a larger community. What are some internal office tactics, if any, that you used with modeling and CDs to kind of streamline the process, or did you have to draw everything from scratch?
Yeah, great question. So I think maybe two answers. One is, although it may look like everything is unique, it is very modularized. And so, for example, with the precast, you know, precast is a world where, like, when we started that project, there was maybe one other building in New York that had precast facade, and now today you see it a lot more. And so I think maybe to piggyback on the last question, like, I think the other thing here that's going to change is construction. New York, in this case, New York construction, you know, is hard to move forward. There are certain standards that we have to kind of begrudgingly get them to move forward. So I think in addition to manual comfort, that's the other thing that like we have to keep pushing. But to answer your question, so something like the precast is a great example, which is all about efficiency. The more the more panel types you have, the more expensive it is. And we were working to a budget that was really trying to replicate brick, which in New York is pretty cheap. It's basically $50 a square foot, and you can have somebody up there and they don't like their work and they can get 10 other people to come in. So it's a pretty tough market to compete against. And so where we worked on it on the precast is to find those efficiencies. So we have a staggered joint pattern. Some of those are not real joints. Some of those are false joints that are in the formwork, so that we're able to get the kind of, the kind of vining up that we liked while getting the most efficient panel type. So there actually, at the end of the day, was a lot of work drawing and specifying just to get the fewest amount of panel types in there, which really reduced the cost quite a lot. And then you want to get, in this case, the biggest panels you can, because every time they pick it with a crane, it costs a lot more money. So also just trying to work with them. Some of these things are, to your point, very technical, but just to work in terms of our kind of design and module to make sure that we're basically maximizing the truck bed length, because in the precast world, that's what the limit is in terms of getting into New York. Because the fewer panels you have, the much less it is. So those are some studies that really, at that time we weren't, for Sugar Hill, we weren't working in like a Revit or parametric world. I think as our technology has come up, and I'm sure you guys are all working in like, other parametric and Revit things, which makes some of the stuff easier as you array them around. But at that time we were just drawing in CAD and really trying to find those efficiencies, manually. So there's a lot, we draw the elevations a lot, we draw the facades a lot. We were just kind of testing those corners and seeing what we can do. Same with the window sizes, they all look slightly different, but it's just about finding that right pattern. There's actually very few window types, they repeat, and being able to work at scale like that with repetition was where we found efficiencies in the project like that.
Great. Before we open it up to students and everyone else who's joining us, I'm going to address Felipe Correa to give a question for us.
Thanks, Katie. And first of all, congratulations for phenomenal presentations. And I wanted to ask a question in two parts. The first one is maybe more addressed to Manuel and Mark. And it has to do, one, with the way in which your projects rethink the idea of domesticity in the 21st century, right? And this, I think, has to do with sort of the idea of what are the standards that we're interested in. Also, the way that new construction materials help us to rethink how we actually organize these spaces. And also sort of, I think, point out that the vast majority of housing projects that we see in New York City, and quite frankly in the world, don't have that level of care and investment put into them. And I'll get back to this point. The other point that I wanted to address is Robert's sort of the bomb inside his presentation. The RPA is always quite amazingly sort of good at putting forward certain statements that are extremely powerful. And the one that I saw that for me is quite powerful here is the idea of expanding the transfer of development rights. Actually expanding those boundaries that sort of, if you actually look at sort of development rights in public housing, that would give New York City a significant amount of square footage in affordable housing, sort of for new affordable housing. And then my question, in a way, is how do we bring these two together? One, how sort of the idea of expanding transfer of development rights can generate new housing projects of a very different scale. And two, how does that then force sort of housing to rethink the way it's designed in the city? How can we bring these two together, right? Sort of design expertise and this increase in scale that the city desperately needs. And maybe Robert, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, I'll offer one thought. I think maybe one interesting exercise or study might be to, and I'm thinking back to the diagram that Moses showed, of how much stuff could go on if you had a larger catchment area for the TDR, for the transfer of development rights. I think it would be interesting to maybe do a survey of those sites and develop a kind of typology of conditions. There would be a lot probably, but maybe to manage it initially, you decide on some number, 30 or 40 conditions, and see the extent to which you can develop kind of prototype solutions for those typical conditions. Some of those conditions would have to do with scale. Some of them would have to do with proximity to transit. So I think that would be, I don't know if that answers your question, or if that's kind of what you're thinking about, but I think there's a role for kind of formal typological exercise that would create a kind of catalog of solutions, and that would facilitate the TDR process.
But I think there's also an opportunity, because of the scale of square footage that would be available, to look into other models of producing affordable housing that go beyond inclusionary zoning, right? That go beyond public-private partnerships. And that's where I think design could actually become very effective in visualizing how these could begin to emerge.
Right.
I'll follow up just by saying that, you know, I think things like this symposium are a really great start, because I think, as you're seeing today, like the reality of these complex problems is they're complex, and we're going to need all hands on deck, right? And that it's, you know, the design part or the architecture part of something like Sugar Hill or whatever project, it's not that it's easy, but we can do that. And everybody's going to do it slightly different, and we can all look at that. But I think the lessons of working through these kinds of projects is that we need to be not just doing that, but also engaging with what Robert's talking about, what Moses is talking about, what, you know, whether it's a not-for-profit developer or for-profit developer, and finding ways to be able to push those models forward and dialogue, because otherwise we are ending up with the status quo, which is, you know, on the contractor side, it's very clear what's the most affordable way to build affordable housing. There's no question about that. That's known, and it's not great. On the development side, we know what the most affordable way to build, that's most profitable way to build affordable housing is for the developers. That's known. It's not confusing. And on the architecture side, you know, we all have desires, but if we only have so much agency and leverage. So if we're only, similar to a studio, responding to a brief and not thinking outside of just a response to something, but able to have agency and find ways to push them forward, or push things like the discussion of comfort that Manuel's talking about, or these new typologies that Robert's talking about, well, we're not going to get very far, because it doesn't matter whether we want, you know, a certain finish or a certain material or a certain volumetric double height space, because we know we love those spaces, but there's no financial way to actually make that a reality. You know, I think we're going to stay with the status quo. So I think maybe it's think tanks, maybe they're models. What I liked about what Ellen is trying to do at Sugar Hill with Broadway Housing is a start of having discussions about how one could replicate those models. And I think this is one of those things where, you know, there are going to be different versions. So I don't know of the kind of open format where we can all get together and exchange ideas in a simple way or in a creative way without it, you know, without it being too daydreamy. But I think sort of being able to have those think tanks or exchange in real ways, kind of boots on the ground ideas, and then hopefully have ways of the city to be able to match that or test those cases in some way, and not a fictitious way, I think is going to be really critical to moving those things forward. And that needs people even from like the construction industry, because there's just standards there that are impossible to push forward unless we engage them and give them incentives to do something other than, you know, brick, for example, or something. So it's a complex problem, and I think we all kind of need to find ways to keep pushing it forward. Things like the symposium are a good start.
I just have one very quick, just one very quick follow-up thought to Felipe's question, which is that in the beginning of relatively early in the beginning of Moses's presentation, he presented this kind of aerial view of this block of housing towers and said, you know, you really can't do anything in here. You know, you can't build anything in the middle of this space. And I have to say, I was sort of thinking to myself, well, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I think that that from his perspective, he's actually quite conservative in terms of the degree to which these places could be transferred. And the middle of that block looked in some ways to me like the perfect place to build. But I think you would have to have a really great architectural solution and a really great urban design solution for how that block is converted. But I think that is where sort of the expertise of the architects is really sort of key.
Yeah, that's exactly where all the UVA students are going to do, right, Matthew?
Yeah, exactly. Katie, are there more student questions or is the floor open?
I think I saw a hand being raised in the chat. Jose,
Okay.
do you have a question?
Yeah, hi, and thank you everyone for the fantastic presentations and the students participating. The questions have also been incredible. Katie, it's great to meet you and see you moderating this too. So I was just kind of following up to what you were asking, Felipe, but now trying to get at it from a pedagogical stance. Because Mark, you were talking a little bit about what the architect needed to know that was beyond just designing beautiful buildings or designing really nice buildings. And I'm asking this because we're in the context of this 70-10, how and also selfishly be teaching a student next semester to undergraduate students here at UVA, and I'm trying to get thoughts from all of you who are professionally, developing projects that deal with so many intricacies of the built environment, developers, etc. What could be where could academia have the greatest impact in these studios? You know, what could we be teaching the students that we might not teach in a normal studio that could enhance how they understand housing and basically enhance housing projects in the future?
I think I can answer, Mark, if you don't mind. Well, I think the academia also has the responsibility of explaining how important is the climate. So I think that, for example, from the school, we are able to talk about issues that are going to be relevant in the future for sure. And it's a research place to explain that and to create this responsibility to the students. And then that, I think it goes directly to the practice, no? I think that is one of the responsibilities of the academia, to create that concern. And finally, this, I think it has the effect, no, on the practice, on the architects. When, no, I think that's one of the responsibilities of the academia for sure. No? For example, in the question about the climate change, the first time that I heard about the climate change, and it was probably, I don't know, 6 years ago with Matthew, you know, talking about the Arctic, for example, creating this important responsibility. That it was 6 years ago, and now it seems that it's something that is totally normal. But 6 or 7 years ago, it was totally new. And I think that is an issue that is today is absolutely, you know, that all the architects are thinking with this.
Yeah, I think that's really well said and really true. Like it is in academia, in those studios, where you have the ability to push things to an extreme in a way that obviously you're never going to be able to do in the real world. And by being able to test things, just like in a scientific lab, is when, you know, you can uncover things. And I think being able to create a safe space and a studio crit culture that allows for some of those extremes to be researched and pushed is extremely, extremely helpful. And a lot of that will set the base to trickle into actually practice. It's not that it will be replicated exactly as it is in the studio, but that you will learn some lessons that could then go, or a small piece of it could then go. And I think too often, you know, I can't speak to UVA and the studios there and how it's run, but too often in many schools and studios, the mode is to replicate what the constraints are in a real practice. And I think that's a huge mistake. because it's not the goal of school in like a semester-long studio project to prove that you're going to be able to solve all the HVAC and all the things and all the metrics. And that's too much. We don't do that in the real world. We would never solve a building or a site in a semester. These are projects and processes that are geological, that take time. But what you can do in a studio is kind of weed out certain things and focus on, say, a particular aspect. And I think the more that studios are allowing for that, so you could say, I'll give you a pass on budget, or I'll give you a pass on structure, or whatever it is, I don't know, but I want you to focus on, this element, and maybe for each studio or each student, it's different what that is. You're able to kind of do a deep dive into that thing, and I think most likely mine something really interesting that would then work its way in. And I mean, when looking back at my time in the studio as a student, I wish I took advantage of that more, because I think too often I was trying to prove that I was like an adequate architect that could solve all the problems, as many people are, and it's understandable. But the more that we could kind of push some of that extreme experiment and make a research area, as Manuel was talking about, I think the better. And then being able to dialogue in ways that we're doing here and have exchange with people in practice, I think will be really key.
That's a great point, Mark. Yeah, especially given the studio, the complexities that are involved. You can imagine just getting lost, and the students, as they begin to develop their ideas about which direction they're going to go with the designs, of what to focus on. And as you're saying, focus on a few things or one or two key kind of themes, and then go and develop them fully, as opposed to trying to do everything at the same time. I just had one question. I'm intrigued. I'm really fascinated, Mark, by the fact that your office, the way you talk about your project, the Sugar Hill project, in this case, and this kind of connection towards community. Because Adji Associates is working at a level in architecture that you would that to have that approach is surprising to me in some ways, because offices will not normally do this. But I'm also kind of fascinated by this awareness in an American context. And we look at Europe, which we consider like social housing and models for social housing. You'd think, vastly far ahead in terms of maybe developing an architecture around these ideas. But Manuel, in your projects, I was really intrigued by the fact that there are, what degree of community involvement were in these sort of public housing projects? So how does that play a role in your design strategies, or how does that, because there, is it so well advanced in terms of thinking about public housing in Europe, or is it, what's the way to think about this?
Mark, please, can you answer that?
Sure. I'll take a stab, and you can follow up. I mean, I think one of the thematics in our office, and what we're really passionate about, even on projects that may not seem obvious at first, is the role of public space, and particularly in the U.S. context. That's very different than I think in Spain or in Europe, or I'm half Swiss, so my time in Switzerland. And one of my first conversations with Mona about the studio was about how public space is different in different places, which I think is really fascinating, particularly compared to Europe. And in New York, a place like that, a lot of the public space is private. And there are pros and cons to that, but what that means. So even on projects like, for example, we just completed a retail store in Los Angeles, which is about commerce and probably the farthest thing from affordable housing. But we took 20% of the footprint to make it a public space and have a public installation of art. And that was not a community board meeting kind of thing like we had in Sugar Hill, but the equivalent discussion with the client about, and again, I think great client that they were able to, agree with us on this, but to push them to say, this is in the corner where probably the most profitable window display would be. And we said, look, let's take that over and make that a public space. And that's the kind of thematic that works through a lot of our projects. William Street downtown is not affordable housing, it's market rate housing, but there's a scale there where we're able to have a really big range that even a medium income can come in there. And part of the keys for us in doing that, because we rarely do developer work, was that there was a public plaza in the front and trying to integrate that and think about that. So I don't think there's any easy answer to it other than it's a really, really important question and something that for us, even on projects that seem pretty private, we try and have a thread that pushes that and brings it through, because I think that public space is like, you know, it's where things can be democratic. It's where we can actually have a community that, you know, edifies everything that people are doing and not just have a class system that is segregated where you have groups of people that don't intermingle. And I think, you know, that's a real issue in a place like New York where you have the nation's most segregated schools. So I think these are really, really important issues that are not only solved architecturally, but this is where as architects, I think we have a lot of agency to really make social change in that way.
Well, I think that when the public or the politics are able to work with architects and they trust in architects, then is the change for sure I think the result arrives for sure. And this, I think, is what has happened, for example, in the case of Barcelona. I think when Pasqual Maragall, who was the mayor at that time, was trusting with the architects, that is when the city started to change totally, absolutely, from a urban point of view, from architectural point of view, from a social point of view, from I think from everything. I have to say that today the politics are not trusting in architects, I think, in Europe. And I think also, I don't know in the States, but I have the perception or the feeling that they are also not trusting so much with architects. And I think that's a big problem. And here with the public housing, I think we have been lucky that the public administration, they have taken this leader responsibility of designing and building, I think, beautiful buildings for people with low income. And I think that when they trust in that, when they trust in the architecture and in the architects, then thanks to that, that started to change also in this case, for example, to the private developers. You know? So for sure, all the people who are living in this housing, public housing, they are really happy. They're really happy because they are living in beautiful, clean, simple spaces, and they feel really happy. They are really they're enjoying a lot. But I think what is important is when the politicians are trusting in architecture. That's really important. And today, I don't know how it's going in the States. Probably it's going not really well, but I don't know. So in Europe, it's also not going really well.
Do we have any more questions from our students or audience?
Yeah, I have a question. It might, well, I'm sorry. Did anybody have another?
Okay. I think last question, and Mona, back to you. Go.
Okay. So I get to actually follow up on this issue of policies and like how politics affect the flow of things. So how did policies and regulations kind of help you or not help you in terms of starting to develop the project and think about it in other terms other than like providing places of comfort and social spaces or private spaces? Did those get affected by those issues of policy? I'm asking this question for Mark and Manuel specifically.
Sure.
In different contexts. Yes,
definitely. and in all sorts of ways. Some very, small scale and dumb, but we were talking about public spaces and, the city is very prescriptive. City plan is very prescriptive about how many linear feet of benches you need, how many have to have backs, what's an obstruction, what they want in it, what kind of bench it is. And there's certain policy things like that I think can be limiting and frustrating. Like the intention is, I take it well-meaning and good, but they are so prescriptive that I think, every time you get like a newer administration, it changes slightly and, it starts to become they're designing for you. There are other policy things. So I think there's frustrations like that you know, you work through, and I think that they could be adjusted in a smarter way. But the principle of them is well intended and fine. There are other policy things like, you know, I think sustainability issues and green zone things that I think are really critical, that certainly change frequently and are impactful. So in Sugar Hill, like what we had for energy standards and things like LEED, you know, that opened in 2015 now to what we're doing today in our projects has changed a lot, even in that short term. And from my experience, again, I'm thinking for partly New York projects, as we were showing you, you know, Sugar Hill, I think this is where it's not that we need a prescriptive design wise, but that where it would be helpful to have more zoning, green energy things, because it's only, you know, developers in particular are going to do what's cheapest. And it's only through some of these policy changes that I or any of us have any leverage to push developers to make, for example, way more green, sustainable buildings. And that's just a given, you know. And however, trying to do those, what they are, how prescriptive they are, you know, is very tough to get right. And so I think we need a process where those could be iterative and kind of workshopped more, because a lot of times they can be, you know, onerous and not that smart. It's hard to do a blanket thing for so many. But I am encouraged that, like, our green building standards, for example, will really be able to make an impact through a larger initiative like that.
Great. Mona, back to you.
I think Manuel wanted to answer.
Well, I was just going just to say that, well, we have to learn and to how to play with the policies and to transform the policy in something that helps to the design. You know? So I have to say also that in some of the projects that we are doing right now, one of the best things that we have done is that problem of that took a lot of time. So, but we modify the policies in some of the projects that we are building now, but that you need to have, again, the administration in favor of what you are proposing. But that, I think, is when that's the best. That's the best. I'm not saying not the word is modify, but probably is to adjust the policy to, I don't know, because sometimes the policies are old, for example, and the context has changed absolutely, so they need to be updated, you know. But when you can work also again with the administration and to have the administration with you, and to, if they are open to change the policy or to adapt the policy to the new situation, because suddenly you have a new road that is passing close to the plot that you are working, and that for sure, you know, needs to be absolutely changed, you know, and modified. That, I think, is when it works the best, you know, because when the urban condition and the architecture and the policies are working together, that's great. That's absolutely great, you know. But again, you need to have the politicians with you, you need to have the administration with you, and that means for sure more time. And well, I have to say that during the crisis that we had in 2010, you know, I was working with all of these issues because I knew that, for example, everything was going to be stopped, you know, a long time, and it was the good moment for changing the policies or for adapting the policies. And I think that is the best when you can work with all of this together.
I want to just piggyback on that a little bit and just say that, and also, you know, to Mark, I'm sure he probably figured this out. You know, New York is a very particular condition, and it is exceptionally difficult to do certain kinds of projects in New York, which is why construction costs in New York are 2 to 3 times what they are in other cities. And of course, that's 2 to 3 times less housing that you can build. I don't think that the students, in terms of the pedagogy of the studio, I think on the one hand, I don't think it makes sense for the students to go down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out the peculiarities of New York policy. However, and zoning. However, I do think it would be interesting for there to be enough familiarity with those, and you know, this is to Manuel's point, to actually make some suggestions about some of the strategic changes that could be made to policy that might make it possible to do certain kinds of projects that can't be done now, or to make them less expensive. And I know it's an architecture and design studio, but I think maybe we'll, you know, if Moses is pulled back into the picture and the students present something, Moses will say, well, you could never do that because of whatever, X, Y, and Z. And so rather than changing the project, then at that point, the thing to say is, well, why does that policy have to be like that? And I think that's the value of the studio, of having people from outside who feel less constrained kind of ask the sort of why not question. And you might get at the things that Manuel was telling about. Well, then let's change the policy, right? So.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you, Manuel, Robert, Mark, and Moses. I have the honor to wrap up the event. We are reaching nearly 4 o'clock, and I learned over the time that Zoom meetings have also their limitations. This was a fantastic afternoon. I want to thank you really in the name of the students, in the name of all instructors, our guests. It was fantastic because we were able really to stitch the different scales, to look at what are policy concerns, what are regional needs, specifically now in the New York area. We were able to talk about projects who had been developed in New York under these conditions with novel or with nonprofit developers who were willed to maybe also take a risk in neighborhoods that aren't easy, where we need a lot of sensitivity to actually work together with the neighborhood community to attach to the local culture. We were able to learn how Europe is maybe, or Barcelona and Spain is trying to solve this, or at least how Manuel is approaching it, which I think was a really great insight to show how affordability can be accomplished through design. We are really interested in bringing you back for our reviews, because as Robert just said, it's important that we have a continuous discussion. The studio is actually framed through a kind of, I don't want to call it out a new model for public-private partnership, but certainly a model that isn't commonly known in New York. It was also developed together with Ian Klein, who's our real estate consultant basically on the studio. And our idea is that students on the one hand side understand zoning, but they are also pushing it to its extent that they are understanding in the moment when they can craft strong design-oriented and community-oriented arguments, they can push these agendas. And our idea for the final review specifically is to invite a diverse group of reviewers so that this can be and continue to be a very interesting and engaging discussion. Because I have to say, I agree with Mark, and I think probably all our instructors and Felipe agree on this, in the classroom, this is where we have the opportunity to push the agenda and to think out of the box. And this imagination that we can bring to the table will also allow others who are a little bit more conservative to think through these alleyways. And there will be a very specific part of the studio where students are asked to tell the story of their building at the end of the review, where we obviously talk about architecture, but we will also talk about what the life of the building is going to be in the future, including people who are going to live there, and maybe politicians that are going to have a second thought after they saw what they realized on the site. So we are extremely excited. I want to thank you again. This was a fantastic discussion, and we hope that you can join us later down the road in the semester for additional feedback and your insight.
Yeah, congratulations on a really great event, and it was great to meet Mark and Manuel.
Likewise, thank you all so much. Great to meet you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much. Yeah,
thank
awesome.
you.
Thank you.
Students,
it's been a pleasure.
Please
it's been a pleasure.
Forward your thank you notes in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.